The mountain man stood in the center of Main Street, blood coating his hands and splattered across his buckskin shirt, his eyes wild with something between rage and desperation. The townspeople of Cedar Falls had formed a loose circle around him, some clutching rifles, others backing toward doorways and alleys. Eugene Phillips, the town's self-appointed leader, stepped forward with his shotgun raised, his voice cutting through the tense silence. "You've got exactly 10 seconds to explain yourself, stranger, before we string you up from that oak tree." The mountain man's chest heaved with each labored breath, his long dark hair matted with sweat and grime. Behind him, tied to a makeshift travois, lay the body of a young woman, her dress torn and bloodied, her face pale as winter snow. The sight of her sent a collective gasp through the crowd, and several women pressed handkerchiefs to their mouths. "She's been murdered," the mountain man said, his voice hoarse and broken. "Found her by Willow Creek this morning. Whoever did this is still out there." But the crowd wasn't listening to his words. They saw only the blood on his clothes, the wild look in his eyes, the way he stood over the dead girl, like some predator guarding his kill. Eugene Phillips cocked his shotgun, the metallic click echoing off the wooden storefronts. "Blood on your hands," says otherwise mountain man. "Timothy Cooper, Jeremy Hall, get some rope." From the window of her small boarding house at the edge of town, Karen Bennett watched the scene unfold with growing horror. She had been kneading bread when the commotion started, and now flour still dusted her apron as she pressed her face against the glass. The mountain man looked up then, his desperate gaze sweeping the crowd until it found hers through the window. For a moment that stretched like eternity, their eyes met, and she saw something there that the others had missed. Not guilt, but anguish. Not the look of a killer, but of a man who had stumbled upon tragedy and carried it to town, seeking justice. Karen's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched Timothy Cooper and Jeremy Hall emerge from the general store with coils of rope. The crowd was growing uglier by the minute, their fear transforming into bloodlust. She knew what would happen next. They would drag the mountain man to the oak tree at the end of Main Street, and by sunset, he would be swaying in the wind, guilty or innocent. Something deep in her chest rebelled against the injustice of it. Perhaps it was because she knew what it felt like to be judged unfairly, to have a whole town turn against you based on whispers and assumptions. Perhaps it was the way the mountain man had looked at her through the window, not with menace, but with the desperate hope of someone seeking an ally in a world gone mad. Before she could think better of it, Karen Bennett stepped out of her boarding house and into the street. "Wait," she called out, her voice clear and strong despite the tremor in her hands. "Just wait a moment." The crowd turned toward her, and she felt the weight of their stares like physical blows. Eugene Phillips lowered his shotgun slightly, his weathered face creasing with irritation. "This ain't your concern, Mrs. Bennett. Go back inside." But Karen was already walking toward them, her flour-dusted apron fluttering in the mountain breeze. She had made her choice, and there was no turning back now. The mountain man watched her approach with something like wonder in his eyes, as if he couldn't quite believe that someone was willing to stand between him and the rope. "It is my concern," Karen said, stopping just outside the circle of townspeople. "We're about to hang a man without trial, without evidence beyond the blood on his clothes. What kind of people does that make us?" "The kind that protect our own," Eugene Phillips snapped. "That girl there is Sarah Mitchell from the Clearwater settlement, 17 years old, with her whole life ahead of her, and this animal killed her." "Did he?" Karen turned to face the mountain man directly. "Did you kill her?" The mountain man straightened, and for the first time since arriving in town, he looked like more than a wild thing driven to desperation. "No, ma'am. I found her by the creek, already dead. Thought she deserved better than being left for the wolves." His voice carried the ring of truth, but the crowd wasn't convinced. Brian Rivera, who owned the saloon, spat in the dust at the mountain man's feet. "Course he'd say that. What killer admits his crime with a rope waiting?" "Then let's find out what really happened," Karen said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Let's examine the body, ask questions, do what civilized people do when faced with tragedy. Don't we owe that much to Sarah Mitchell? Don't we owe that much to ourselves?" The crowd shifted restlessly, and Karen could feel their bloodlust wavering. Eugene Phillips studied her with narrowed eyes, and she knew he was weighing the politics of the situation. Karen Bennett might be a widow living alone at the edge of town, but she was still a respectable woman, and her words carried weight. "You vouching for this man, Mrs. Bennett?" Eugene asked finally. Karen looked at the mountain man again, taking in his weathered face, the genuine anguish in his dark eyes, the careful way he stood near the travois, as if still protecting the dead girl even now. She thought of her late husband Thomas, who had always said that you could judge a man's character not by his words, but by what he did when he thought no one was watching. This man had found a murdered girl and brought her to town for proper burial, knowing full well that he would be suspected of the crime. That spoke to a kind of honor that was rare in this harsh country. "Yes," she said, the word coming out clear and strong. "I am." The crowd erupted in angry murmurs, but Eugene Phillips held up a hand for silence. He was a practical man, and Karen Bennett's endorsement complicated things. She was respected in the community, despite the whispers about her living alone and taking in boarders. More importantly, she was educated, having been a school teacher before her marriage, and her judgment carried weight with some of the more thoughtful townspeople. "All right then," Eugene said finally, "we'll do this proper. But that man stays under guard, and if we find evidence he's guilty, he hangs before sunset." "Mrs. Bennett, since you're so concerned with justice, you can be responsible for him until we sort this out." Karen felt the blood drain from her face as the full implications of what she had done hit her. She had just made herself responsible for a man she didn't know, a mountain man covered in blood who might very well be a killer. But she had committed herself now, and there was no backing down. "I understand," she said quietly. The mountain man stepped forward then, and Karen got her first close look at him. He was tall and lean, with the kind of weathered strength that came from years of living rough in the wilderness. His dark hair hung past his shoulders, and his beard was full but neatly trimmed. Despite the blood on his clothes and the wild look in his eyes, there was something almost gentle about the way he moved, like a man trying very hard not to frighten anyone. "Ma'am," he said, his voice soft with gratitude. "I'm much obliged." "Don't thank me yet," Karen replied. "We still need to find out what really happened to that poor girl. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments." Dr. Justin Young, the town's physician, had agreed to examine Sarah Mitchell's body, and the crowd slowly began to disperse as the immediate threat of violence passed. Eugene Phillips assigned Timothy Cooper and Jeremy Hall to keep watch on the mountain man, but Karen noticed that their grip on their rifles had relaxed somewhat. The immediate bloodlust was fading, replaced by a more thoughtful consideration of the situation. "What's your name?" Karen asked the mountain man as they walked toward her boarding house. "Brian Rivera," he said, then caught himself. "No, that's not right." "Sorry, ma'am. It's been a long few days." "Name's Justin Young." Karen frowned. "The doctor's name is Justin Young." The mountain man shook his head, running a hand through his tangled hair. "Jeremy Hall, then." "Jeremy Hall." But Jeremy Hall was one of the men guarding him, and Karen realized that the mountain man was either lying or so shaken by recent events that he couldn't think straight. Either possibility troubled her, but she had committed herself to his cause, and she would see it through. "Let's start over," she said gently. "What should I call you?" The mountain man stopped walking and looked at her with eyes that held depths of pain she was only beginning to understand. "Most folks just call me Mountain Man. Been so long since I used my real name, I sometimes forget what it is." "That won't do," Karen said firmly. "A man needs a proper name. What did your mother call you?" For a moment, something soft flickered across the mountain man's weathered features. "Timothy," he said quietly. "Timothy Cooper." Timothy, but Timothy Cooper was also one of the guards, and Karen realized that the mountain man was giving her the names of the townspeople around him, as if his own identity had become so fragmented that he could only define himself in relation to others. The thought filled her with unexpected sadness. "I'll call you Timothy then," she said, deciding not to press the issue further. They reached her boarding house, a modest two-story structure that had seen better days but was still solid and welcoming. Karen had inherited it from her late husband Thomas, along with a small debt that she had been slowly paying off by taking in travelers and seasonal workers. It wasn't much, but it was home, and it was hers. Timothy Cooper, as she had decided to think of him, stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at the house with something like wonder. It had been a long time since he had seen a real home, with curtains in the windows and flower boxes under the sills. Karen noticed his hesitation and understood it. A man who lived in the wilderness might find the confines of civilization overwhelming after months or years of open sky. "It's all right," she said gently. "You're safe here." Timothy nodded and followed her up the steps, his movements careful and deliberate. On the porch, he stopped again and looked back toward town, where Dr. Young was examining Sarah Mitchell's body in the middle of Main Street. The crowd had thinned, but there were still plenty of people watching, waiting to see what the doctor would find. "She was just a girl," Timothy said, his voice heavy with grief. "Couldn't have been much older than 16 or 17. Had her whole life ahead of her." "Tell me what happened," Karen said, settling into one of the rocking chairs on her porch. "From the beginning." Timothy sat down heavily in the other chair, and Karen noticed how he kept his blood-stained hands carefully away from the clean wood of the armrests. He stared out at the mountains for a long moment, gathering his thoughts. "I was checking my traps along Willow Creek," he began. "Been having trouble with something getting into them, eating the bait and leaving the traps empty. Thought it might be a bear, so I was being extra careful, moving quiet through the trees." He paused, and Karen could see the memory playing out behind his eyes, painful and vivid. "That's when I heard the screaming. High and desperate, like nothing I ever heard before. By the time I got there, it was over. She was lying by the water's edge, her dress torn, blood everywhere. I thought maybe she was still alive, so I went to help her. But," Timothy's voice trailed off, and he shook his head slowly. "She was already gone. Had been for a while, I think. But I couldn't just leave her there. Seemed wrong, leaving a young girl for the scavengers. So I made a travois and brought her here, thinking her family would want to bury her proper." "Did you see anyone else? Any sign of who might have done this?" Timothy nodded grimly. "Tracks leading away from the creek, boot prints, heading north toward the high country. Looked like maybe two men, one heavier than the other. But by the time I got her ready to travel, the trail was getting cold." Karen studied his face as he spoke, looking for any sign of deception, but all she saw was genuine grief and anger, the kind that came from witnessing senseless violence against the innocent. She was beginning to believe that her instincts had been right, that this man was not a killer but a witness to tragedy. "Why didn't you follow the tracks?" she asked. "If you knew who did this was getting away?" Timothy looked down at his blood-stained hands. "Because she deserved better than being left alone in the woods. I've seen what happens to bodies that aren't found quickly. The animals, the weather. I couldn't let that happen to her." His answer struck Karen as both noble and heartbreaking. Here was a man who had chosen to sacrifice his chance at catching the real killers in order to preserve a dead girl's dignity. It was the kind of choice that spoke to character, to a moral code that put compassion above personal interests. Down in the street, Dr. Young was finishing his examination of Sarah Mitchell's body. Karen could see him speaking earnestly with Eugene Phillips and the other town leaders, his hands gesturing as he explained his findings. She hoped that whatever he had discovered would support Timothy's story, but she knew that even medical evidence might not be enough to overcome the town's suspicions. "Tell me about yourself," Karen said, wanting to understand the man she had chosen to defend. "How long have you been living in the mountains?" Timothy was quiet for so long that Karen thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was distant, as if he were reaching back through years of solitude to find memories he had tried to forget. 7 years, maybe 8. Hard to keep track of time when every day looks the same. I came out here after I lost everything that mattered to me." "What did you lose?" Another long silence, and Karen began to think she had pushed too far. But then Timothy turned to look at her, and she saw a vulnerability in his eyes that he usually kept hidden. "My wife and daughter. Cholera took them both in the space of a week. I was working in the mines then, making good money. Thought I was building something for them. Came home one day to find them both burning with fever, and by the next week, they were gone." Karen felt her heart clench with sympathy. She knew something about loss, about the way grief could reshape a person's entire world. But to lose a wife and child at the same time, to have your whole family wiped away in a matter of days, that was a kind of pain she could barely imagine. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "That must have been unbearable." Timothy nodded, his gaze returning to the mountains. Couldn't stay in town after that. Everywhere I looked, I saw them. Their favorite shop, the church where we were married, the school where my little girl would have started learning her letters. So I packed what I could carry and headed for the high country. And you've been alone all this time? Mostly. Sometimes I trade with the trappers or the survey crews, but I don't much care for company anymore. People ask questions, want to know your story. Easier to just stay up in the mountains, where the only sounds are wind and water and the animals going about their business. Karen could understand the appeal of solitude when the world had dealt you such a crushing blow. But she also understood the danger of it, the way isolation could eat away at a person's humanity until they forgot how to connect with others. Looking at Timothy now, she could see both sides of that equation. He was still fundamentally decent, still capable of compassion, as his treatment of Sarah Mitchell proved. But there was also a wildness about him, a sense that he had been away from civilization for so long that he no longer quite fit within its boundaries. Dr. Young was walking toward them now, his medical bag in one hand and a grim expression on his weathered face. Behind him came Eugene Phillips and several other town leaders, their faces set with the kind of determination that usually preceded bad news. Karen felt her stomach tighten with apprehension. "Mrs. Bennett," Dr. Young called out as he approached the porch, "I need to speak with you and your guest." Timothy stood up slowly, his hand instinctively moving toward the knife at his belt before he caught himself and let his arm drop. The gesture was so subtle that Karen almost missed it, but it reminded her that this man had been living by his wits and his weapons for years. Civilization might offer the promise of justice and fair treatment, but in the wilderness, survival often came down to how quickly you could defend yourself. "What did you find, Doctor?" Karen asked, rising from her chair. "Doctor." Young climbed the porch steps, his movements careful and deliberate. He was a man in his 60s, with silver hair and the kind of steady hands that came from decades of dealing with medical emergencies. Karen had always respected him, both for his skill as a physician and for his willingness to treat anyone who needed help, regardless of their ability to pay. "The girl was murdered. No question about that, Doctor," Young said, setting his bag down and wiping his hands on a clean cloth. "But the wounds, they tell a different story than what some folks are assuming." Eugene Phillips stepped forward, his shotgun still cradled in his arms. "What kind of story, Doc?" "She was stabbed multiple times, but the wounds are all in her back. Whoever killed her attacked from behind, probably while she was trying to run away. The angle and depth of the wounds suggest someone taller than her, which fits with most adult men." Timothy leaned forward slightly. "What about the blood on my clothes?" Dr. Young studied him carefully. "From what I can tell, that blood came from handling the body after death. There's no spatter pattern, no arterial spray. If you had been the one stabbing her, there would be blood on your arms, your face, probably under your fingernails. But what I see looks like someone who picked up a body that had already bled out." Karen felt a wave of relief wash over her, but she could see that Eugene Phillips was not entirely convinced. The town leader's face remained skeptical, his grip on the shotgun unchanged. "That's all well and good, Doc, but it doesn't prove he didn't kill her. Maybe he cleaned himself up before coming to town." "With what?" Dr. Young asked pointedly. "The creek where he says he found her is 3 miles from here, and it's been dry for weeks. There's barely enough water there to fill a canteen, let alone wash blood off clothes and skin. Besides, if he was trying to hide evidence, why would he bring the body to town at all? Why not just bury her in the woods where no one would ever find her?" It was a good point, and Karen could see that it was having an effect on some of the townspeople. But Eugene Phillips was a stubborn man, and he had already committed himself to a course of action that would be difficult to abandon without losing face. "Maybe he's just crazy," Eugene said. "Living alone in the mountains for years, talking to himself, eating whatever he can catch. Maybe he killed her in a fit of madness and then forgot what he did." Timothy spoke up then, his voice calm but edged with steel. "I may live alone, Mr. Phillips, but I'm not crazy. I remember every detail of finding that girl, and I remember every step of the journey bringing her here. If I had killed her, I would remember that too." "Would you?" Eugene challenged. "Or would your mind have blocked it out, the way a man's mind sometimes does, when he's done something too terrible to face?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel, and Karen could see that it had shaken Timothy more than he wanted to admit. She had heard of such things, cases where men committed acts so horrible that their minds refused to acknowledge them. But looking at Timothy now, seeing the genuine confusion and hurt in his eyes, she found it impossible to believe that he was capable of murdering a young girl. "There's something else," Dr. Young said, reaching into his medical bag. "I found this clutched in the girl's hand." He held up a small piece of fabric, dark blue wool that looked like it had been torn from someone's coat or shirt. Timothy looked down at his own clothes, buckskin and rough cotton in shades of brown and tan. None of it matched the fabric in the doctor's hand. "Whoever killed her," she fought back. Dr. Young continued, "got a piece of his clothing before he finished her. This mountain man here isn't wearing anything that matches." Eugene Phillips examined the fabric, turning it over in his weathered hands. Karen could see him weighing the evidence, trying to decide whether it was enough to overcome his suspicions. Finally, he looked up at Timothy with narrowed eyes. "All right, mountain man. Maybe you didn't kill her, but that doesn't mean you're free to go. Someone murdered that girl, and until we find out who, everyone's a suspect." "What are you saying?" Karen asked, though she already suspected she knew. "I'm saying he stays in town where we can keep an eye on him. And since you vouch for him, Mrs. Bennett, he's your responsibility. He stays at your boarding house, and you make sure he doesn't go anywhere without an escort." Karen felt the weight of that responsibility settle on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. She had saved Timothy from a lynching, but in doing so, she had also made herself his jailer. The irony was not lost on her, and she could see from Timothy's expression that he understood it too. "For how long?" she asked. "Until we find the real killer," Eugene said, "or until we decide there isn't one to find." The first few days of Timothy's stay at Karen's boarding house passed in a strange kind of suspended animation. He kept to his room most of the time, a small but clean space on the second floor that looked out over the mountains he had called home for so many years. Karen brought him meals and tried to make conversation, but he seemed lost in his own thoughts, struggling to adapt to the confines of civilization after years of unlimited freedom. Karen found herself studying him when she thought he wasn't looking, trying to understand the man she had chosen to defend. He was unfailingly polite, always thanking her for the food and apologizing for any inconvenience his presence might cause. But there was a restlessness about him, a barely contained energy that reminded her of a wild animal pacing in a cage. On the third morning, she found him standing at his window before dawn, staring out at the mountains with an expression of such longing that it made her heart ache. She had brought him coffee and biscuits, thinking to start the day with a proper breakfast. But the sight of him there, silhouetted against the pale morning light, stopped her in her doorway. "You miss it," she said softly. Timothy turned, and she could see that he hadn't slept. His dark hair was disheveled, his clothes wrinkled from a night spent sitting in the chair by the window, rather than lying in the bed she had provided. "Every minute," he admitted. "Up there, I knew who I was. Down here, I feel like I'm pretending to be someone I'm not." Karen set the tray down on the small table by the window and poured him a cup of coffee. The steam rose between them, carrying the rich aroma that had become one of the small comforts of her daily routine. "Who are you up there?" she asked, settling into the room's only other chair. Timothy accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping his hands around the warm cup as if drawing strength from it. "Someone who doesn't need to explain himself to anyone. Someone who lives by his own rules, who takes care of himself and doesn't depend on the kindness of strangers. And down here? Down here, I'm a charity case, a potential killer being watched by the woman who saved his neck." He looked at her over the rim of his coffee cup. "Why did you do it, Mrs. Bennett? Why did you step in when the whole town was ready to string me up?" Karen had been asking herself the same question for 3 days, and she still wasn't entirely sure of the answer. Part of it was simple human decency, the same impulse that would make her help an injured animal or feed a hungry stranger. But there was something more, something she was reluctant to examine too closely. "I suppose I recognize something in your eyes," she said finally, the look of someone who had been judged unfairly. Timothy studied her face, and Karen had the uncomfortable feeling that he could see more than she intended to reveal. "You've been judged unfairly yourself." It wasn't a question, and Karen felt heat rise in her cheeks. She had hoped that her own story wouldn't become part of this conversation, but she realized that Timothy was too perceptive to let it slide. Small towns have long memories, she said carefully, and people like to talk. What do they say about you? Karen stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the town that had been her home for 15 years, but had never quite accepted her completely. They say I'm not grieving properly, that a decent widow would have sold this place and gone to live with relatives somewhere. They say it's unseemly for a woman to run a business alone, to take in strange men as boarders. And what do you say? I say that I'm doing what I have to do to survive. The words came out more forcefully than she had intended, and she could hear the defiance in her own voice. My husband left me this place in a pile of debts. I could have sold it and moved away, but then what? Become a burden on distant relatives who barely remember my name? Spend the rest of my life being grateful for handouts and sleeping in spare rooms? Timothy was quiet for a moment, considering her words. So you chose independence over respectability. I chose survival over surrender. Karen turned back to face him. Maybe that makes me selfish or stubborn or unwomanly, but it's the choice I made. And now you're paying the price for it. Karen nodded. Every day, in the whispers when I walk down Main Street, in the way some people cross to the other side of the road when they see me coming, in the assumption that any woman living alone must be desperate enough to take in murderers and outlaws. Is that what you think I am? A murderer? The question hung between them like a challenge, and Karen realized that this was the moment of truth. For 3 days she had been operating on instinct and hope, but now Timothy was asking her to make a conscious choice about what she believed. No, she said without hesitation. I think you're a man who has been running from grief for so long that you've forgotten how to live with other people. I think you found that girl and brought her to town because it was the right thing to do, even though you knew it would cause you trouble. And I think you're probably the most honorable man in Cedar Falls, even if you are the most inconvenient. Timothy's expression softened, and for the first time since arriving in town, he almost smiled. Most inconvenient? You have no idea what you've done to my reputation, Karen said, but there was warmth in her voice rather than accusation. Karen Bennett, the widow who vouched for the Bloody Mountain Man, that's going to follow me for years. I'm sorry, Timothy said, and she could hear the genuine regret in his voice. I never meant to make trouble for you. I know you didn't, and I'd make the same choice again, if I had to. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, drinking their coffee and watching the town wake up below. Karen could see people moving along Main Street, opening shops, and beginning the daily routines that defined their lives. It looked peaceful and normal, but she knew that underneath the surface, tensions were running high. Someone had murdered Sarah Mitchell, and until that person was caught, everyone in Cedar Falls would be looking over their shoulders. Mrs. Bennett, Timothy said eventually. Karen, there's something I need to tell you. The serious tone in his voice made Karen's stomach tighten with apprehension. What is it? My name isn't really Timothy Cooper. I've been giving people false names because I've been running from my past for so long that sometimes I forget who I really am. Karen set down her coffee cup carefully. What is your real name? Eugene Phillips, Timothy said, then shook his head in frustration. No, that's not right either. That's the name of the man who wanted to hang me. Karen realized that Timothy was more confused than she had initially thought. The years of isolation had clearly taken a toll on his mental state, making it difficult for him to maintain a clear sense of his own identity. It was troubling, but it also made her more certain that he was not a killer. A man who struggled to remember his own name was unlikely to be capable of the kind of calculated violence that had ended Sarah Mitchell's life. It's all right, she said gently. Names don't matter as much as actions. Whatever you want to be called, I'll call you. I think I'd like to go back to my real name, Timothy said slowly. It's been so long since anyone used it that I almost forgot what it sounded like. My name is Brian Rivera. But Brian Rivera was the name of the saloon owner, and Karen realized that Timothy was still pulling names from the people around him. She decided not to press the issue further. Whatever his real name was, it would come back to him when he was ready. Brian, she said, testing the name. I like it. A knock at the front door interrupted their conversation, and Karen excused herself to answer it. She found Brenda Thompson, one of the town's most prominent gossips, standing on her porch with a basket covered by a checkered cloth. Good morning, Karen, Brenda said, her voice bright with false cheer. I brought you some fresh bread. Thought you might need it. What with your... Guest? Staying here. Karen accepted the basket, knowing that Brenda's real purpose was to get a look at Timothy and gather information for the rumor mill. That's very kind of you, Brenda. Would you like to come in for coffee? Oh, I couldn't impose, Brenda said, but she was already craning her neck to see past Karen into the house. Is he here? The mountain man? His name is Brian, Karen said firmly. And yes, he's here, eating breakfast like any normal person. Is it true what they're saying? That he's not quite right in the head? Karen felt a flash of anger at the casual cruelty of the question. He's been living alone for years, Brenda. That would affect anyone. But he's perfectly rational and quite polite. Still, you must be frightened, having him in your house. A man like that, with all that blood on his hands. The blood belonged to the girl he was trying to help, Karen said, her patience wearing thin. Dr. Young confirmed that. Well, yes, but still. Brenda leaned closer, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. Sharon Turner says she saw him talking to himself yesterday, having whole conversations with people who weren't there. And Linda Ross swears he was staring at her through the window of the general store like he was planning something terrible. Karen had heard enough. Brenda, I appreciate your concern, but Brian is my guest and my responsibility. If you have specific accusations to make, I suggest you take them to Eugene Phillips. Otherwise, I'd appreciate it if you'd keep your speculation to yourself. Brenda's face flushed with indignation. Well, I was just trying to be neighborly, and I'm trying to be fair to a man who may be innocent, Karen replied. Good day, Brenda. She closed the door before Brenda could respond, but she knew that the conversation would be all over town within the hour. Karen Bennett, defending her dangerous guest and being rude to respectable women, it would only add to the whispers and speculation that already surrounded her. When she returned to Timothy's room, she found him standing by the window again, but this time he was watching the street below with a different kind of attention. His body was tense, alert, like a hunter who had spotted prey. What is it? Karen asked, moving to stand beside him. There, Timothy said, pointing toward the general store. That man talking to the store owner. I've seen him before. Karen followed his gaze and saw a stranger in conversation with Linda Ross. He was tall and well-dressed, with dark hair and a neatly trimmed beard. Nothing about him seemed particularly threatening or unusual. Where did you see him? The day I found the girl. He was riding north from Willow Creek, moving fast like he was trying to get somewhere in a hurry. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now. Karen studied the stranger more carefully. He seemed to be asking Linda questions, gesturing toward the mountains and then toward Karen's boarding house. There was something urgent about his manner, something that didn't quite fit with casual conversation. We should tell Eugene Phillips, Karen said. Timothy nodded, but he didn't move away from the window. He's asking about me. I can tell from the way they keep looking over here. Karen could see it too now, the way Linda Ross kept glancing toward the boarding house while she talked. The stranger followed her gaze, and for a moment, his eyes met Timothy's through the window. Even at that distance, Karen could see him stiffen with recognition. He knows you, she said. And I know him, Timothy replied grimly. Question is, what's he doing in Cedar Falls, and why is he so interested in finding me? The stranger concluded his conversation with Linda Ross and began walking toward the boarding house. His movements were purposeful, confident, like a man who had found what he was looking for. Timothy stepped back from the window, his hand instinctively moving toward the knife at his belt. Karen, he said urgently, I need you to listen to me carefully. That man is dangerous, more dangerous than you can imagine. If he's here, it means I've brought trouble to your door, and I'm sorry for that. What kind of trouble? Before Timothy could answer, there was another knock at the front door. This time it wasn't the polite tapping of a neighbor bringing bread, but the firm, demanding knock of someone who expected to be answered immediately. Karen looked at Timothy, seeing the fear and determination warring in his dark eyes. Whatever was happening, she realized that the peaceful interlude of the past 3 days was over. The outside world had found them, and with it came the kind of trouble that could destroy everything she had worked so hard to build. Stay here, she said. Let me handle this. But Timothy was already shaking his head. No, Karen. This is my fight, not yours. You've done enough for me already. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. Karen could hear voices outside, more than one person. Whatever was happening, it was bigger than just the well-dressed stranger. "We'll handle it together," Karen said firmly. "That's what partners do." Timothy looked at her with surprise. "Partners? You saved that girl's dignity by bringing her to town. I saved you from a lynching. We're both trying to find the truth about what happened to her. That makes us partners, whether you like it or not." For the first time since she had met him, Timothy smiled genuinely. It transformed his weathered face, revealing the man he might have been if grief and isolation hadn't carved such deep lines around his eyes. "All right then, partner," he said. "Let's go see what kind of trouble has come calling." Karen descended the stairs with Timothy close behind her, both of them moving carefully and quietly. Through the frosted glass of the front door, she could see several silhouettes, and the murmur of voices suggested at least 3 or 4 people. The knocking had stopped, but she could sense them waiting, patient as predators. "Mrs. Bennet," came a voice from outside, smooth and educated with just a hint of authority. "My name is Jeremy Hall. I'd like to speak with you about your guest." Karen glanced back at Timothy, who had gone pale at the sound of the name. But Jeremy Hall was one of the townspeople, one of the men who had been assigned to guard Timothy. This had to be someone else. Someone using a false name just as Timothy had been doing. "What about him?" Karen called through the door. "I believe he has something that belongs to me. If you'll just let me speak with him, I'm sure we can resolve this matter peacefully." Timothy moved closer to Karen, his voice barely above a whisper. "Don't let him in. He's not here to talk." "How do you know?" "Because I know what I took from his camp, and he's not the forgiving type." Before Karen could ask what he meant, Eugene Phillips's voice joined the conversation from outside. "Mrs. Bennet, this is Eugene Phillips. This gentleman says he has information about the mountain man that might help us solve Sarah Mitchell's murder. I think you should hear what he has to say." Karen felt trapped between competing loyalties. Eugene Phillips was the town's leader, and if he thought this stranger had important information, she could hardly refuse to listen. But Timothy's fear was palpable, and she trusted his instincts about danger more than Eugene's judgment about justice. "Give me a moment," she called out, then turned to Timothy. "What did you take from his camp?" Timothy ran a hand through his hair, looking more agitated than she had ever seen him. "I didn't know it was his camp at the time. Found it abandoned, or so I thought, with supplies scattered around like whoever had been there left in a hurry. There was food, ammunition, and—" He paused, reaching into his jacket and pulling out a small leather pouch. "This—" Karen took the pouch and opened it, gasping at what she found inside. Gold coins, more than she had ever seen in one place, enough money to buy a small farm or start a new life somewhere far from Cedar Falls. "You found this just lying around?" "Hidden under a loose stone near the fire pit. But the camp looked deserted, and I needed supplies. I left behind some of my own gear to make it a fair trade." "Timothy," Karen said slowly, "this is a fortune. Nobody abandons this kind of money unless they're running from something terrible, or they're planning to come back for it." "I know that now," Timothy said miserably. "But at the time, I thought maybe whoever owned it was dead. People die in the mountains all the time, from weather or animals or just plain bad luck. I figured if I didn't take it, someone else would." The knocking resumed, more insistent than before. Karen could hear Eugene Phillips talking to the stranger, their voices low and urgent. Whatever story the man had told, it was convincing enough to bring the town's leader to her door. "Mrs. Bennet," Eugene called out, "I'm going to have to insist that you open this door. We have reason to believe that your guest may have committed crimes beyond what happened to Sarah Mitchell." Karen looked at Timothy, seeing the resignation in his eyes. He was preparing to surrender, to walk out that door and face whatever accusations the stranger had brought against him. But something in her rebelled against the idea of handing him over without knowing the full story. "What crimes?" she called back. "Theft, for one thing," came the smooth voice of the man calling himself Jeremy Hall. "I'm a federal marshal, Mrs. Bennet, and I've been tracking this man for weeks. He robbed a supply train outside of Denver and killed 2 guards in the process." Karen felt the blood drain from her face. A federal marshal changed everything. This wasn't just about local justice anymore, but about federal crimes that carried the death penalty. She looked at Timothy, searching his face for any sign of guilt or deception. "Is it true?" she whispered. "No," Timothy said firmly. "I've never been to Denver, never robbed anyone, never killed anyone except in self-defense. But I did take that gold from his camp, and if he's a marshal, that makes me a thief in the eyes of the law." "How do you know he's not really a marshal?" Timothy moved to the window beside the door and peered out through a gap in the curtains. "Because I saw him 2 days before I found Sarah Mitchell's body. He was camped by Willow Creek with another man, and they were arguing about something. When they saw me watching, they both went for their guns. I got away, but I heard them talking about finding someone, about settling a score." "You think they killed Sarah Mitchell?" "I think they were looking for me. And she got in the way somehow. Maybe she saw something she shouldn't have seen, or maybe they thought she knew where I was hiding." The pieces were starting to come together in Karen's mind, forming a picture that was both terrifying and heartbreaking. Sarah Mitchell, a 17-year-old girl, had died because she had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. And Timothy, already carrying the burden of bringing her body to town, was now being framed for her murder by the very men who had killed her. "Mrs. Bennett," Eugene Phillips called out, his voice taking on a harder edge. "I'm going to count to 10. And then I'm coming in, whether you open this door or not. 1, 2. Karen made her decision. "Timothy, is there another way out of this house?" "The back door leads to the alley, but they'll have someone watching it." "What about upstairs? Can you get to the roof?" Timothy nodded. "There's a window in the attic that opens onto the back slope of the roof. From there, I could probably make it to the ground without being seen." 5, 6. Eugene's count continued relentlessly. "Go," Karen said urgently. "Get to the mountains. Find somewhere safe to hide. I'll try to buy you some time. I can't leave you to face this alone." "You can and you will. If that man really is a federal marshal, he'll have legal authority that I can't fight. But if he's lying, then the truth will come out eventually." 7, 8. Timothy hesitated for a moment longer, then leaned forward and kissed Karen's forehead gently. "Thank you," he said, "for everything." Then he was gone, moving silently up the stairs toward the attic. Karen waited until she heard his footsteps overhead, then walked to the front door and opened it just as Eugene Phillips reached 10. Eugene stood on her porch with 3 other men, including the well-dressed stranger who claimed to be a federal marshal. The man was younger than she had expected, probably in his 30s, with cold blue eyes and the kind of smile that never reached beyond his lips. "Mrs. Bennett," the stranger said, tipping his hat politely. "Thank you for your cooperation. I'm Marshal Jeremy Hall, and I need to speak with the man you've been harboring." "He's not here," Karen said, which was technically true since Timothy was presumably on the roof by now. "Now, Mrs. Bennett," Eugene said sternly, "this is no time for games. We know he's been staying here." "He was staying here," Karen corrected, "but he left early this morning to check on something in the mountains. Said he'd be back by evening." The false marshal studied her face carefully, looking for signs of deception. Karen met his gaze steadily, drawing on years of experience dealing with difficult borders and suspicious townspeople. "Which direction did he go?" the marshal asked. "North, toward the high peaks. He said something about wanting to look at the place where he found the girl, see if he could find any more clues about what happened to her." It was a plausible story, and Karen could see that Eugene Phillips was inclined to believe it, but the false marshal's eyes remained cold and calculating. "I think we should search the house," he said, "just to be sure." "You have no right," Karen said firmly. "This is my home, and you have no warrant." "I have federal authority," the marshal replied, reaching into his coat and producing a badge and some official-looking papers. "These give me the right to search any property where I have reason to believe a federal fugitive might be hiding." Karen examined the badge and papers, but she had no way of knowing if they were genuine. They looked official enough, with seals and signatures that seemed authentic. But Timothy's words echoed in her mind. "He's not here to talk." "Very well," she said, stepping aside. "But I want witnesses to everything you do. I won't have you planting evidence or stealing from me." The marshal's smile turned genuinely amused. "Of course, Mrs. Bennett. We're all honest men here." He entered the house with Eugene Phillips and the other townspeople following. Karen watched as they searched the ground floor methodically, looking behind furniture and in closets. The marshal moved with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was looking for, and Karen began to hope that Timothy had made it safely to the roof. But then they reached the stairs, and Karen's heart sank. If Timothy was still in the attic, trying to get to the roof window, the sound of footsteps on the stairs would alert him to their presence. And if he was already on the roof, they might see him from the upstairs windows. "Mrs. Bennet," the marshal said as they reached the second floor, "you seem nervous. Is there something you'd like to tell me?" "I'm nervous because I have strange men searching my house," Karen replied. Any woman would be nervous under these circumstances. So, they searched Timothy's room first, the marshal paying particular attention to the bed and the chair by the window. He seemed disappointed not to find the room still warm from recent occupation. "He really did leave this morning," Eugene Phillips said, sounding almost apologetic. "Looks like the bed wasn't slept in." Karen silently blessed Timothy for his restless night by the window. The unmade bed was perfect evidence that he had been gone for hours. But then the marshal noticed the coffee cups on the table by the window, and his eyes sharpened with interest. "2 cups," he observed. "Were you having breakfast with your guest before he left, Mrs. Bennet?" Karen felt trapped. The coffee cups were clear evidence that Timothy had been there recently, but she couldn't very well deny it now. "Yes," she said. "We had coffee together before he left." "How thoughtful of you," the marshal said, but there was something mocking in his tone. "And what did you talk about?" "The weather, his plans for the day, nothing important." The marshal picked up one of the coffee cups and examined it closely. "Still warm," he said with satisfaction. "Your guest left very recently, didn't he, Mrs. Bennet? Perhaps when he heard us knocking at your door?" Before Karen could answer, a sound came from overhead. A soft thump, like someone moving carefully across wooden beams. Everyone in the room froze, listening. "What was that?" Eugene Phillips asked. "Probably just the house settling," Karen said quickly. "These old buildings make all sorts of noises." But the marshal was already moving toward the door. "Let's check the attic," he said. Karen's heart hammered against her ribs as they climbed the narrow stairs to the attic. The space was small and cramped, filled with old furniture and boxes of belongings that Karen hadn't been able to bear throwing away after Thomas died. Dust motes danced in the pale light that filtered through the single window at the far end. The window was open. The marshal crossed to the window and leaned out, scanning the roof and the alley beyond. "He was here," he said with grim satisfaction. "Probably made it to the ground just before we came up." Eugene Phillips looked embarrassed and angry. "Mrs. Bennet, you lied to us. You said he left this morning." "I said he wasn't here," Karen replied. "And he's not. But he was here when we knocked on your door." "Yes," Karen admitted. "And now he's gone. Which means you're too late to arrest him, doesn't it, Marshal?" The false marshal turned away from the window, his cold eyes fixed on Karen with undisguised hostility. "You helped a federal fugitive escape, Mrs. Bennet. That makes you an accessory to his crimes." "What crimes?" Karen challenged. "All I've seen are accusations and a badge that could have been bought in any big city. If you're really a federal marshal, where are your deputies? Where's your warrant? Why are you working with local law enforcement instead of taking jurisdiction yourself?" The question seemed to catch the marshal off guard, and Karen pressed her advantage. "I think you're no more a federal marshal than I am. I think you're exactly what Timothy said you were, a dangerous man who killed Sarah Mitchell and now wants to frame him for it." The marshal's hand moved toward his gun, but Eugene Phillips stepped between them. "Now hold on," Eugene said. "Let's not have any shooting in here. Mrs. Bennet, those are serious accusations you're making." "And I stand by them," Karen said firmly. "This man is not what he claims to be, and if you help him, you'll be making a terrible mistake." "She's trying to protect her lover," the marshal said coldly. "It's obvious that she's been harboring this criminal, probably helping him plan more robberies and murders. I wouldn't be surprised if she was involved in Sarah Mitchell's death as well." The accusation hit Karen like a physical blow. To be accused of involvement in the murder of an innocent girl was almost more than she could bear. But she could see that the marshal's words were having an effect on Eugene Phillips and the other townspeople. Doubt was creeping into their eyes, the kind of doubt that could destroy her reputation and her life in Cedar Falls. "That's a lie," she said, but her voice came out weaker than she intended. Is it? The marshal pressed. You vouched for a man covered in blood. You took him into your home, fed him, protected him from justice. And now you've helped him escape federal custody. What am I supposed to think? Eugene Phillips was wavering. Karen could see it in his face. The marshal's story was plausible, and it explained Karen's behavior in a way that made her look guilty rather than compassionate. Eugene, she said desperately, you've known me for 15 years. Do you really think I'm capable of murder? I don't know what to think anymore, Karen, Eugene replied sadly. A week ago, I would have said no, but a week ago, I wouldn't have thought you'd harbor a fugitive either. The marshal smiled triumphantly. I think we need to take Mrs. Bennett into custody as well. She's clearly been working with the mountain man, and she may have information about other crimes he's committed. Now hold on, said Timothy Cooper, the real Timothy Cooper, who had been one of Timothy's guards. That seems a bit extreme. Mrs. Bennett's a respectable woman. Respectable women don't help murderers escape, the marshal replied, and they don't lie to federal officers. Karen realized that she was trapped. The marshal had turned the townspeople against her, making her look like an accomplice rather than a victim of circumstance. And with Timothy gone, she had no way to prove that the marshal was lying about his identity. But then she remembered something. The piece of blue fabric that Dr. Young had found in Sarah Mitchell's hand. The fabric that didn't match Timothy's clothes, but might very well match something the marshal was wearing. Dr. Young, she said suddenly. Where's Dr. Young? What does the doctor have to do with anything? Eugene Phillips asked. He found evidence at the crime scene. Evidence that might prove who really killed Sarah Mitchell. The marshal's expression darkened. The only evidence that matters is the mountain man's guilt. Everything else is just distraction. Then you won't mind if we compare that piece of fabric to your coat, Karen said boldly. For a moment, the marshal's composure slipped, and Karen saw something dangerous flicker in his cold blue eyes. It was only for an instant, but it was enough to confirm her suspicions. This man was not a federal marshal, and he was very much afraid of what Dr. Young's evidence might reveal. I don't have time for foolish games, the marshal said, regaining his composure. We need to find that mountain man before he gets too far into the wilderness. But Eugene Phillips was looking at the marshal with new interest. You know, Mrs. Bennett has a point. It wouldn't hurt to check, just to eliminate any doubts. I said no, the marshal replied sharply. I have federal authority here, and I'm ordering you to help me track down that fugitive. The change in his tone was subtle but significant. He had gone from polite cooperation to outright command, and Karen could see that it was making the townspeople uncomfortable. Federal marshals were supposed to work with local law enforcement, not order them around like subordinates. Maybe we should get Dr. Young up here, Timothy Cooper suggested. Just to be thorough. The marshal's hand moved toward his gun again, and this time Karen was sure he was going to draw it. But before he could, a new voice called out from downstairs. Mrs. Bennett, are you up there? It's Dr. Young. The doctor's arrival couldn't have been more perfectly timed. Karen felt a surge of hope as his footsteps sounded on the stairs, climbing toward the attic where they all stood in tense confrontation. Doctor, Eugene Phillips called out, we need you to look at something. Dr. Young appeared in the attic doorway, slightly out of breath from the climb. He took in the scene with sharp eyes, noting the open window, the tension in the room, and the way the marshal's hand hovered near his weapon. What's going on up here? He asked. This gentleman claims to be a federal marshal, Karen said quickly. He says Timothy robbed a supply train and killed 2 guards, but I think he's the one who killed Sarah Mitchell, and I think that piece of fabric you found will prove it. Dr. Young studied the marshal with professional interest. Is that so? Well, it's easy enough to check. I have the fabric right here. He reached into his medical bag and produced the small piece of blue wool that had been clutched in Sarah Mitchell's dead hand. Karen watched the marshal's face carefully as Dr. Young held up the evidence, and she saw him go pale despite his efforts to remain composed. Now then, Dr. Young said, looking at the marshal's dark blue coat. Let's see if this matches. No. The marshal stepped back as Dr. Young approached with the fabric, his hand now openly resting on the grip of his pistol. I don't have time for this nonsense, he said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. That mountain man is getting farther away every minute we waste on foolish theories. But Dr. Young was not easily intimidated. He had been practicing medicine on the frontier for 30 years, and he had dealt with his share of dangerous men. "It will only take a moment," he said calmly, holding the fabric up against the marshal's coat sleeve. Even in the dim light of the attic, the match was unmistakable. The blue wool was identical in color and texture to the marshal's coat, and there was even a small tear in the sleeve that corresponded perfectly to the shape of the fabric in Dr. Young's hand. "Well, I'll be damned," Eugene Phillips breathed. The marshal's composure finally cracked completely. "You're all making a terrible mistake," he snarled, drawing his pistol in one smooth motion. "I'm a federal officer, and you're interfering with official business." But the evidence was too clear to ignore, and the townspeople were no longer intimidated by his claims of authority. Timothy Cooper, the real Timothy Cooper, drew his own weapon and pointed it at the marshal. "I think you'd better drop that gun, mister. Federal marshal or not, that fabric says you were there when Sarah Mitchell died." "It proves nothing," the marshal said desperately. "That fabric could have come from anywhere. Someone could have planted it on the body to frame me." "Who?" Dr. Young asked reasonably. "Who else knew you were in the area? Who else had access to your coat?" The marshal's eyes darted around the room, looking for an escape route, but there was nowhere to go. The attic had only one entrance, and it was blocked by armed men who were no longer willing to believe his story. "There was another man with you," Karen said suddenly, remembering Timothy's account of seeing two men arguing by Willow Creek. "Timothy saw you both. Where is he now?" "I don't know what you're talking about," the marshal said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I think you do," Karen pressed. "I think he was your partner, and I think something went wrong. Maybe he wanted to leave Sarah Mitchell alone, and you killed her anyway. Maybe he threatened to turn you in, and you had to silence him too." The marshal's face was white with fury and fear. "You don't understand anything. That girl saw us, saw what we were doing. She could have identified us, ruined everything." The admission hung in the air like smoke, and Karen felt a mixture of vindication and horror. She had been right about the marshal's guilt, but hearing him confess to murdering an innocent girl made her feel sick. "What were you doing?" Eugene Phillips demanded. "What was worth killing a child over?" The marshal laughed bitterly. "You think this is about one girl? This is about enough gold to buy half of Colorado territory. That mountain man of yours stumbled onto our operation and stole our entire stake." "What operation?" Dr. Young asked. "We've been robbing supply trains for months, taking just enough each time to avoid suspicion. Built up a fortune in gold and gems, enough to disappear and live like kings somewhere far from here. But then that crazy mountain man found our camp and took everything." Karen felt the pieces clicking into place. "So you came after him, but Sarah Mitchell got in the way." "She was in the wrong place at the wrong time," the marshal said coldly. "We were tracking the mountain man when we saw her by the creek. She recognized my partner from somewhere, started screaming about how he was wanted for murder in 3 states. We couldn't let her go." "So you killed her," Eugene Phillips said, his voice heavy with disgust. "My partner killed her," the marshal corrected. "I told him to just tie her up, leave her where she wouldn't be found for a few days. But he panicked, said she'd seen too much. Before I could stop him, he'd put a knife in her back. And then I killed him," the marshal said matter-of-factly. "He was getting sloppy, making mistakes. The girl's death was proof of that. I couldn't trust him not to get us both caught." The casual way he spoke about murder made Karen's skin crawl. This man had killed 2 people in cold blood and felt no remorse about either death. He was exactly the kind of predator that Timothy had been trying to escape by living alone in the mountains. "Where's the body?" Timothy Cooper asked. "Your partner's body?" "Buried him in the woods north of Willow Creek. Animals will have scattered the bones by now." Eugene Phillips shook his head in disgust. "And you were going to let us hang an innocent man for your crimes." "He's not innocent," the marshal said. "He stole our gold. That makes him a thief, and thieves deserve whatever they get. He found what he thought was abandoned property and took only what he needed to survive," Karen said angrily. "That's not the same as robbing supply trains and murdering innocent people." The marshal's eyes fixed on her with cold hatred. "You're very protective of your mountain man, aren't you, Mrs. Bennett? Makes me wonder what kind of relationship you really have with him." The insinuation made Karen's cheeks burn with anger and embarrassment, but she refused to be intimidated. The kind of relationship that decent people have with each other. Mutual respect and concern for justice. Justice? The marshal spat. There's no justice in this world, only power and money. Your mountain man understood that when he took our gold. Too bad he wasn't smart enough to disappear with it. He brought Sarah Mitchell's body to town for proper burial. Dr. Young said quietly. That tells me everything I need to know about his character. It tells me he's a fool, the marshal replied. If he'd left her for the animals, none of this would have happened. I'd have my gold back, and he'd still be free in his precious mountains. The callousness of the statement seemed to break something in Eugene Phillips. The town leader stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. You're a monster, he said. That girl was 17 years old. She had family, friends, a whole life ahead of her. And you killed her for money. I didn't kill her, the marshal said. My partner did. I just failed to prevent it. And then you came to town, planning to frame an innocent man for the crime. I came to town to get my property back. Framing the mountain man was just a convenient way to close the case and avoid further investigation. Karen realized that they were dealing with someone who was completely without conscience, someone who saw other people as nothing more than obstacles to be removed or tools to be used. It was a chilling glimpse into a kind of evil that she had never encountered before. Well, your plan failed, she said. Timothy got away, and now we know the truth about what happened to Sarah Mitchell. The marshal's grip tightened on his pistol. He got away, but he won't get far. I know these mountains better than he thinks, and I know where he's likely to go. With or without your help, I'll find him and get my gold back. Not if we find him first, Eugene Phillips said grimly. And when we do, he'll be under our protection, not yours. You have no authority to protect him from federal charges, the marshal said, falling back on his false identity one more time. And you have no authority to make federal charges. Timothy Cooper replied. That badge of yours is probably as fake as everything else about you. The marshal's face twisted with rage. You people have no idea what you're interfering with. This is bigger than one dead girl, bigger than one mountain man, bigger than your pathetic little town. What do you mean? Dr. Young asked. I mean, there are others involved, people with real power and real authority. When they find out what happened here, they'll make sure this whole town pays for interfering with their business. Karen felt a chill run down her spine. If the marshal was telling the truth, then exposing his crimes might bring even greater danger to Cedar Falls. But she couldn't let that possibility stop her from doing what was right. Then we'd better make sure the real authorities know what happened, she said. The territorial governor, the federal marshal's service, maybe even the army. Someone needs to know about this robbery ring you've been running. The marshal laughed harshly. You think the authorities aren't already involved? You think we could have operated for months without someone in power looking the other way? The implications of his words were staggering. If he was telling the truth, then the corruption went much deeper than a few outlaws robbing supply trains. It suggested a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. You're lying, Eugene Phillips said, but there was uncertainty in his voice. Am I? How do you think we knew which trains to hit, which routes they'd be taking, how much gold they'd be carrying? That kind of information doesn't come cheap, and it doesn't come from honest sources. Karen realized that they were in much more danger than she had initially thought. If the marshal was part of a larger criminal organization with connections to territorial officials, then exposing him might bring retaliation against the entire town. But the alternative was to let him go free, to allow him to continue his crimes and probably murder Timothy when he found him. That was unacceptable, regardless of the consequences. It doesn't matter, she said firmly. We can't let you go free, knowing what you've done. Sarah Mitchell deserves justice, and Timothy deserves protection. Justice, the marshal said mockingly. From a town full of farmers and shopkeepers, from a widow who takes in strays and an old doctor who's probably never seen real violence in his life? You have no idea what you're up against. Maybe not, Eugene Phillips said, but we know right from wrong, and we know that you're on the wrong side of both. The marshal's eyes narrowed, and Karen could see him calculating his chances. He was outnumbered and surrounded, but he was also desperate and dangerous. A man with nothing to lose was capable of almost anything. Last chance, he said, raising his pistol. Let me walk out of here, and I'll forget this conversation ever happened. Try to stop me, and people are going to die. Starting with you, Timothy Cooper said grimly, his own weapon trained on the marshal's chest. For a moment that stretched like eternity, the two men faced each other across the cramped attic, fingers on triggers, death hanging in the balance. Karen held her breath, knowing that the next few seconds would determine not just their immediate fate, but the future of everyone in Cedar Falls. Then the marshal made his choice. Instead of shooting Timothy Cooper, he spun toward the open window, clearly intending to leap to the roof and make his escape. But his desperation made him careless, and his foot caught on a loose floorboard. The marshal stumbled, his shot going wild, the bullet burying itself harmlessly in the wooden ceiling. Timothy Cooper didn't hesitate. His return shot took the marshal in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into a stack of old furniture. The marshal's pistol flew from his hand, clattering across the floor to land near Karen's feet. She quickly kicked it away, out of his reach, while Dr. Young moved forward to examine his wound. It's not fatal, the doctor announced after a quick examination. The bullet went clean through the shoulder. He'll live to stand trial. The marshal glared up at them from where he lay, among the scattered furniture, his face pale with pain and fury. This isn't over, he said through gritted teeth. You have no idea what you've started. We've started the process of justice, Karen replied. Something that should have begun the moment you killed Sarah Mitchell. Eugene Phillips was already taking charge, organizing the other men to secure the marshal and tend to his wound. Timothy, Jeremy, help me get him downstairs. Doctor, Young, can you patch him up well enough for transport? Where are you taking him? Karen asked. To the territorial capital, Eugene replied. If what he says about corruption is true, then we need to find someone in authority who isn't compromised. The territorial governor. Maybe, or the army commander at Fort Collins. That's a 3-day ride, Dr. Young pointed out. And he's in no condition to travel that distance right away. Then we'll wait until he is, Eugene said firmly. But I'm not keeping him in our jail any longer than necessary. Too much risk of his friends coming to break him out. As they helped the wounded marshal to his feet, Karen realized that their troubles were far from over. They had captured one criminal, but there were others out there, possibly including corrupt officials who would want to silence anyone who knew about their involvement. And Timothy was still somewhere in the mountains, alone and hunted, carrying a fortune in stolen gold that made him a target for every outlaw and bounty hunter in the territory. We need to find Timothy, she said. Warn him about what's really going on. How? Eugene Phillips asked. He could be anywhere in those mountains, and we don't even know his real name. Karen thought about the man she had come to know over the past few days. The gentle soul hiding behind the wild exterior. The person who had sacrificed his own safety to bring a dead girl home for proper burial. I know where he'll go, she said quietly. Where? Back to Willow Creek, to look for evidence that will clear his name. He's not the kind of man who runs from trouble, not when innocent people are at stake. Eugene Phillips studied her face. You're sure about that? As sure as I am about anything, Karen replied. Timothy Cooper, or whatever his real name is a good man caught up in a bad situation. He'll try to make it right, even if it costs him his life. Then we'd better get to him before these criminals do, Eugene said grimly. But as they made their way downstairs with their prisoner, Karen couldn't shake the feeling that they were already too late, that somewhere in the wilderness, Timothy was walking into a trap that would destroy him and everyone who tried to help him. The marshal's wound required more attention than Dr. Young had initially thought. What had seemed like a clean shot through the shoulder turned out to have nicked an artery, causing more blood loss than was immediately apparent. By the time they got him downstairs and onto Karen's kitchen table, he was pale and weak, barely conscious. He's not going anywhere for at least a week, Dr. Young announced after cleaning and bandaging the wound. Maybe longer, depending on how well he heals. Eugene Phillips looked frustrated. We can't keep him here that long. It's too dangerous for Mrs. Bennett and too risky for the town. Then what do you suggest? Dr. Young asked. Move him to the jail? Our jail is just a single cell with bars that a determined man could probably break, and if what he said about having powerful friends is true, they might try to break him out or silence him permanently. Karen had been thinking about the same problem. Cedar Falls was a small town with limited resources for dealing with dangerous criminals. Their jail was designed to hold drunks and petty thieves, not murderous outlaws with connections to territorial corruption. What about the old mine shaft? Timothy Cooper suggested. The one up on Copper Ridge? It's isolated, defensible, and there's only one way in or out. Eugene Phillips considered the idea. That might work. We could post guards, make sure he doesn't escape or get rescued by his friends. But it's a hard climb up there, especially for a wounded man. We could use a wagon to get him most of the way, Jeremy Hall offered. There's an old mining road that goes about halfway up the ridge. As they discussed logistics, Karen found herself thinking about Timothy, alone somewhere in the wilderness, with a fortune in stolen gold and half the criminal underworld probably looking for him. The marshal had been confident that he could track Timothy down, which suggested that there were others out there with the same goal. I still think we need to warn Timothy, she said, interrupting the conversation about prisoner transport. And I still think that's a job for the territorial authorities, Eugene Phillips replied. We've done our part by capturing this killer. Now we need to let the law handle the rest. What if the law is compromised? What if the people we turn him over to are part of the same criminal organization? Eugene's face showed his frustration with the complexity of the situation. Then what do you suggest, Karen? That we take justice into our own hands? That we become vigilantes? I suggest we make sure an innocent man doesn't die because we were too cautious to help him. Dr. Young looked up from where he was monitoring the marshal's condition. Mrs. Bennett has a point, Eugene. If this man's story about corruption is true, then we can't trust anyone in territorial government until we know who's involved. So what do we do? Keep him prisoner indefinitely? Start our own investigation? We're not equipped for this kind of thing. The marshal stirred on the kitchen table, his eyes fluttering open. Despite his weakness, there was still malice in his gaze as he focused on Karen. You're all making a terrible mistake, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. When my associates realize I'm missing, they'll come looking. And when they find me here, they'll burn this whole town to the ground. Who are your associates? Eugene Phillips demanded. Give us names. The marshal smiled weakly. Go to hell. Go to hell. We know about the supply train robberies, Dr. Young said. We know about the corruption in the territorial government. What we don't know is how deep it goes. Deeper than you can imagine, the marshal replied, and wider than you can handle. Karen leaned closer to the table. What about Sarah Mitchell? Was killing her part of your plan, or just an unfortunate accident? The marshal's expression softened slightly, and for a moment Karen thought she saw something like regret in his eyes. The girl was never supposed to die. She was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. But you let your partner kill her anyway. I couldn't stop him. He was already drawing his knife before I realized what he intended to do. By the time I reacted, it was too late, and then you killed him for it. I killed him because he was a liability. The girl's death was sloppy, unnecessary. It drew attention we couldn't afford. Karen felt sick listening to the casual way he discussed murder. She was 17 years old. She had a name, a family, dreams for the future. She wasn't just an inconvenience to be eliminated. In my line of work, sentiment is a luxury you can't afford, the marshal replied. The moment you start seeing victims as people instead of obstacles, you're finished. Then maybe it's time you were finished, Timothy Cooper said grimly. The marshal tried to laugh, but it came out as more of a cough. You think capturing me solves anything? I'm just one man in an organization that spans 3 territories. Cut off one head, and 2 more grow back. Then we'll cut off those heads too, Eugene Phillips said with determination. With what? A handful of farmers and shopkeepers? You have no idea what you're up against. Karen was beginning to understand the scope of the problem they faced. If the marshal was telling the truth, then they weren't just dealing with a few outlaws, but with an organized criminal enterprise with connections throughout the territorial government. It was the kind of enemy that could destroy Cedar Falls without breaking a sweat. But that didn't change the fact that Timothy was out there somewhere, innocent of the crimes he was accused of and carrying stolen gold that made him a target for every criminal in the territory. I'm going after him, she said suddenly. Everyone in the room turned to look at her with expressions ranging from surprise to alarm. Karen, that's insane, Eugene Phillips said. You have no experience in the wilderness, no idea how to track someone, and no way to defend yourself against the kind of people who are hunting him. I know Timothy better than any of you do, Karen replied. I know how he thinks, where he's likely to go, what he's likely to do. And I'm probably the only person he trusts enough to listen to. It's too dangerous, Dr. Young said gently. These are violent criminals we're dealing with, people who kill without hesitation. You could be walking into a death trap. Timothy walked into a death trap when he brought Sarah Mitchell's body to town, Karen said. He did it because it was the right thing to do, even though he knew it would cause him trouble. Now it's my turn to do the right thing. This is different, Eugene Phillips argued. Timothy is a man who's been living in the wilderness for years. He knows how to survive out there, how to defend himself. You're a school teacher turned boarding house keeper. You have no business chasing outlaws through the mountains. Karen felt her temper rising. I'm also a woman who's been taking care of herself for 5 years, running a business, dealing with difficult people, making hard decisions every day. Don't assume that because I wear skirts and bake bread, I'm helpless. Nobody's saying you're helpless, Timothy Cooper said diplomatically. But tracking a man through the wilderness is different from running a boarding house. It requires skills you don't have. Then teach me, Karen said. Or better yet, come with me. Some of you must have experience hunting, tracking, surviving in the mountains. The men exchanged glances, and Karen could see them weighing the risks and benefits of her proposal. She knew it sounded crazy, but she also knew that Timothy's life might depend on someone warning him about the forces arrayed against him. Even if we agreed to help you, Eugene Phillips said slowly, we'd be leaving the town undefended. What happens if more of these criminals show up while we're gone? Then the people who stay behind will have to deal with them, Karen replied. But if we don't warn Timothy, he's going to die. And if he dies, we lose our best witness to what really happened to Sarah Mitchell. It was a compelling argument, and Karen could see that it was having an effect. Timothy was the only person who could definitively prove the marshal's guilt, and without his testimony, they might not be able to convince the territorial authorities that a crime had even been committed. There's another problem, Dr. Young said quietly. The gold. If Timothy still has it, and if it really does represent months of robbery proceeds, then it's evidence of a much larger criminal conspiracy. We need that gold to prove our case against the marshal's associates. Karen hadn't thought about the legal implications of the stolen money. If Timothy was found with it, he could be charged as an accessory to the robberies, even though he had taken it innocently. But if the gold disappeared, there might not be enough evidence to prosecute the larger conspiracy. All the more reason to find him quickly, she said, before he decides to disappear with the money. You really think he'd do that? Eugene Phillips asked. Karen thought about the man she had come to know over the past few days, the gentle soul who had risked his own safety to bring a dead girl home for proper burial. No, she said honestly. I think he'll try to return it to its rightful owners, whoever they are, but I also think he'll try to clear his name first, and that might get him killed. The marshal stirred again on the table, his eyes opening to focus on their conversation. You're wasting your time, he said weakly. My associates are already tracking him. They'll find him long before you do. How many associates? Eugene Phillips demanded. Enough, the marshal replied with a weak smile. And they're better at this than you are. Karen felt a chill of fear for Timothy's safety. If professional criminals were already hunting him, then his chances of survival were slim indeed. But that only made it more urgent that they try to help him. I'm going, she said firmly. With or without help, I'm going to find Timothy and warn him about what's happening. Karen, please be reasonable, Dr. Young pleaded. You could get yourself killed, and you won't help Timothy by becoming another victim. And I won't help him by sitting here doing nothing while criminals hunt him down like an animal. Eugene Phillips sighed heavily. If you're determined to do this, then you're not going alone. Timothy, Jeremy, can you track a man through the mountains? Both men nodded. We've done our share of hunting, Timothy Cooper replied, and we know the country around Willow Creek pretty well. Then you'll go with Mrs. Bennett. But I want you to understand the risks. These aren't ordinary outlaws you're dealing with. They're organized, well-armed, and completely ruthless. If you run into them, your only chance is to get away fast. What about the marshal? Jeremy Hall asked. We can't just leave him here unguarded. I'll stay with him, Dr. Young said, along with Brian Rivera and a couple of the other men. We'll move him up to the old mine shaft as soon as he's stable enough to travel. Karen felt a surge of gratitude toward the men who were willing to help her. She knew they thought her plan was foolish and dangerous, but they were willing to risk their own lives to support her decision. When do we leave? She asked. First light, Eugene Phillips replied. That gives us time to gather supplies and plan our route. But I want everyone to understand something. This is a rescue mission, not a military campaign. If we find Timothy, we warn him and try to get him to safety. We don't go looking for trouble with these criminals. Understood, Karen said, though she privately wondered if they would have any choice in the matter. If the marshal's associates were already in the mountains looking for Timothy, then trouble might find them whether they went looking for it or not. As the group began to disperse, making plans for the morning's departure, Karen found herself alone with the wounded marshal. His eyes were closed, but she could tell he was still conscious, still listening to everything that was being said. You know you're sending them to their deaths, he said without opening his eyes. I'm trying to save an innocent man's life, Karen replied. Innocent? The marshal's voice was filled with contempt. He stole our gold. That makes him a thief, and thieves don't deserve protection. He found what he thought was abandoned property and took only what he needed to survive. That's not the same as robbing supply trains and murdering guards. The law doesn't make distinctions based on intent. Theft is theft, murder is murder. And what about Sarah Mitchell? What law covers the murder of innocent girls? For the first time, the marshal's composure cracked slightly. That was regrettable. But it doesn't change the fact that your mountain man is a criminal. Karen leaned closer to the table. Tell me something. If your partner hadn't killed Sarah Mitchell, what would you have done with her? Just let her go? The marshal was quiet for a long moment. When he finally answered, his voice was barely audible. We would have had to kill her anyway. She'd seen too much, could have identified us. The only difference is that it would have been cleaner, more professional. The casual admission of planned murder made Karen's stomach turn. She realized that she was dealing with someone who was completely without conscience. Someone who saw human life as nothing more than an obstacle to be removed when convenient. You're a monster, she said quietly. I'm a businessman, the marshal replied. And in business, sometimes you have to make hard choices. There's nothing hard about choosing not to murder innocent people. Isn't there? What if that innocent person's life stood between you and everything you'd worked for? What if letting them live meant losing everything and probably dying yourself? Karen thought about the question seriously. Would she be capable of murder if her own survival depended on it? She wanted to say no, but she wasn't entirely certain. The frontier was a harsh place that sometimes demanded harsh choices. But there was a difference between killing in immediate self-defense and murdering someone to cover up other crimes. Sarah Mitchell had posed no immediate threat to anyone. She had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Sarah Mitchell was 17 years old, Karen said. She had her whole life ahead of her. What gave you the right to take that away from her? The same thing that gives you the right to risk other people's lives to save your mountain man, the marshal replied. Self-interest. The difference is that I'm honest about it. The comparison stung because it contained a grain of truth. Karen was asking other people to risk their lives for Timothy, just as the marshal had been willing to sacrifice Sarah Mitchell for his own purposes. But there was still a fundamental difference in their motivations. I'm trying to save a life, Karen said. You were trying to save money. And which is more important to you? The life of a man you barely know, or the safety of the people you're asking to help you? It was a question that Karen didn't want to answer, because she wasn't sure she would like what it revealed about her own character. Was she being selfish in asking others to risk their lives for Timothy? Was she putting her own feelings ahead of their safety? But then she thought about Sarah Mitchell, lying dead by Willow Creek, because she had witnessed something she shouldn't have seen. And she thought about Timothy, alone in the wilderness with a target on his back, guilty of nothing more than trying to help a murdered girl. Some things were worth fighting for, even if the fight was dangerous. Some principles were worth defending, even if the cost was high. And some people were worth saving, even if saving them put others at risk. Timothy didn't choose to become involved in this, she said finally. He was dragged into it by circumstances beyond his control. The least we can do is give him a chance to survive it. The marshal smiled weakly. Noble sentiments, Mrs. Bennet. I hope you still feel that way when your friends are dying in the mountains. Karen didn't answer. She couldn't, because part of her was afraid that the marshal might be right, but she had made her choice, and she would see it through to whatever end awaited them in the wilderness. Dawn came cold and gray to Cedar Falls, with a bitter wind blowing down from the high peaks that promised snow before the day was done. Karen stood on her front porch, checking the supplies that Timothy Cooper and Jeremy Hall had assembled for their journey into the mountains. She had never been on an expedition like this before, and the weight of her pack felt strange across her shoulders. You sure about this, Mrs. Bennet? Timothy Cooper asked for what must have been the 10th time. It's not too late to change your mind. Karen adjusted the straps of her pack and checked the small revolver that Dr. Young had insisted she carry. She had never fired a gun before, but the doctor had given her a quick lesson in loading and aiming. She hoped she wouldn't need to use it. I'm sure, she said, though her voice sounded less confident than she wanted it to. Jeremy Hall finished checking his rifle and slung it across his back. The weather's turning bad. We might run into snow in the high country. Then we'd better move fast, Karen replied. Timothy's been out there for almost 2 days now. If these criminals are really hunting him, we may already be too late. Eugene Phillips emerged from the boarding house, where he had been checking on the wounded marshal one last time. He's stable enough to move, he reported. We'll get him up to the mine shaft this afternoon. Any change in his attitude? Karen asked. Is he willing to tell us more about his associates? Not a word. He just lies there smiling like he knows something we don't. Karen felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain wind. The marshal's confidence was troubling, suggesting that he believed rescue was coming or that his associates would succeed in their hunt for Timothy, regardless of what happened to him. Maybe we should reconsider this, Jeremy Hall said, noticing her expression. If he's that sure his people will find the mountain man, maybe we're walking into a trap. Or maybe he's bluffing, Karen replied. Either way, we can't abandon Timothy based on the word of a murderer. Dr. Young approached from the direction of his office, carrying a medical kit and additional supplies. I've put together some basic medical supplies, he said, handing the kit to Timothy Cooper. Bandages, laudanum for pain, some herbs that might help with infection. If anyone gets hurt out there, you'll be on your own until you can get back to town. The reminder of their isolation was sobering. In the wilderness, a simple injury could become life-threatening without proper medical care. And if they encountered the marshal's associates, injuries would be the least of their worries. Dr. Young, Karen said, what did you do with the piece of fabric from Sarah Mitchell's hand? The evidence that proves the marshal was there when she died? It's locked in my office safe, the doctor replied, along with my notes about the examination and the marshal's confession. Even if something happens to all of us, the evidence will still be there. It was a small comfort, but an important one. If they didn't return from the mountains, at least the truth about Sarah Mitchell's murder would survive. Time to go, Timothy Cooper said, shouldering his pack. We've got a long climb ahead of us, and the weather's not getting any better. Karen took one last look at her boarding house, wondering if she would ever see it again. The windows looked dark and empty without her presence, and she realized that this might be the end of the life she had built for herself in Cedar Falls. But some things were more important than personal security. They set out along the trail that led north toward Willow Creek, moving in single file with Timothy Cooper in the lead. The path was familiar to Karen for the first few miles, as it passed through farmland and settlements that she had visited many times. But as they climbed higher into the mountains, the landscape became wild and unfamiliar. The trail grew steeper and more treacherous as they ascended, winding through stands of pine and aspen that blocked much of the morning light. Karen found herself breathing hard from the exertion in the thin mountain air, but she forced herself to keep up with the two men. She had insisted on making this journey, and she wouldn't slow them down. After 2 hours of steady climbing, they reached a rocky outcrop that offered a view of the valley below. Timothy Cooper called a halt, and they gratefully dropped their packs to rest. Willow Creek is about 3 miles that way, Timothy Cooper said, pointing toward a distant line of trees. If the mountain man went back there looking for evidence, that's where we'll find him. Or where we'll find his body, Jeremy Hall added grimly. Karen pulled out her water bottle and took a careful sip. They had brought enough water for 3 days, but it was heavy to carry and had to be rationed carefully. How long to get there? Another 2 hours if we push hard, Timothy Cooper replied. But we need to be careful as we get closer. If there are other people in the area, we don't want to walk into an ambush. The thought of an ambush made Karen's stomach tighten with fear. She had been so focused on finding Timothy that she hadn't fully considered the danger they were walking into. But it was too late for second thoughts now. They resumed their climb, moving more cautiously as they approached Willow Creek. The wind had picked up, carrying with it the scent of snow and the promise of a storm. Dark clouds were gathering over the high peaks, and Karen could feel the temperature dropping. "There!" Jeremy Hall said suddenly, pointing ahead to where smoke was rising from a stand of trees near the creek. "Someone's got a fire going." Timothy Cooper studied the smoke through a small spyglass. "Can't tell who it is from here. Could be our mountain man. Could be someone else. Only one way to find out," Karen said, but Timothy Cooper held up a hand for silence. "Listen," he whispered. In the distance, they could hear the sound of voices carried on the wind. Men's voices, raised in anger or excitement. And then, unmistakably, the sound of gunshots. "Trouble," Jeremy Hall said, checking his rifle. They moved forward more carefully now, using the trees for cover as they approached the source of the smoke and voices. As they got closer, Karen could make out individual words, though she couldn't see the speakers yet. "I know you're in there, mountain man," someone was shouting. "Come out with our gold and we'll make it quick." Timothy's voice answered from somewhere near the creek, strained but defiant. "I don't have your gold anymore. I left it in town with people who'll make sure it gets back to its rightful owners." "Liar," came another voice. "You wouldn't trust townspeople with that kind of money. Now come out before we come in after you." Karen felt her heart racing as she realized that Timothy was trapped somewhere near the creek, surrounded by the marshal's associates. The rescue mission had become something much more dangerous. Timothy Cooper motioned for them to move closer, and they crept forward until they could see the situation clearly. 3 men with rifles were positioned around a large boulder near the creek, apparently keeping Timothy pinned down behind it. The men looked professional and well-armed, exactly the kind of dangerous criminals the marshal had described. "What do we do?" Jeremy Hall whispered. Karen studied the scene, trying to think of a way to help Timothy without getting themselves killed in the process. The 3 gunmen had good positions and clear fields of fire. Any attempt to approach them directly would be suicide. But then she noticed something that the gunmen apparently hadn't. There was a game trail that led down to the creek about 50 yards upstream from where Timothy was trapped. If they could reach it without being seen, they might be able to get behind the gunmen and create a distraction. "There," she whispered, pointing out the trail. "If we can get down there without being spotted, we might be able to help him." Timothy Cooper studied the terrain and nodded slowly. "It's risky, but it might work. Jeremy, you stay here and be ready to provide covering fire. Mrs. Bennett and I will try to work our way around behind them." "I should go alone," Timothy Cooper said. "This is too dangerous for a civilian." "I'm not a civilian anymore," Karen replied grimly. Before Timothy Cooper could argue further, the situation at the creek took a turn for the worse. One of the gunmen had apparently grown tired of waiting and was moving toward Timothy's position, using the cover of trees and rocks to get closer. "He's trying to flank him," Jeremy Hall observed. "If he gets around behind that boulder, the mountain man is finished." Karen made her decision. Without waiting for permission from her companions, she started down the game trail, moving as quietly as she could through the underbrush. She could hear Timothy Cooper cursing behind her, but he followed, knowing that he couldn't let her go alone. The trail was steeper and more treacherous than it had looked from above, and Karen had to concentrate on every step to avoid falling. Behind her, she could hear the continuing exchange of gunfire from the creek, punctuated by shouted demands and defiant responses. They were halfway down the trail when disaster struck. Karen's foot slipped on a loose rock, sending a small avalanche of stones tumbling down toward the creek. The noise was loud enough to alert the gunmen, and she heard one of them shout a warning to his companions. "Someone's up there," the voice called out. "Looks like the mountain man brought friends." Gunfire erupted from multiple directions as the criminals tried to locate and eliminate the new threat. Karen pressed herself against the ground as bullets whined overhead, splintering tree branches and ricocheting off rocks. Timothy Cooper crawled up beside her, his rifle ready. "So much for the element of surprise," he said grimly. From their position on the trail, they could see one of the gunmen moving toward them, using the cover of boulders to get closer. He was young and lean, with the kind of predatory confidence that came from years of violence. "You picked the wrong fight, strangers," he called out. "This is none of your business." "We're making it our business," Timothy Cooper called back, raising his rifle. The exchange of gunfire that followed was brief but intense. The gunman was skilled and experienced, but Timothy Cooper had the advantage of better cover and a superior position. When the shooting stopped, the criminal lay motionless among the rocks. But the victory came at a cost. The other two gunmen now knew exactly where Karen and Timothy Cooper were positioned, and they were moving to surround them. From his position behind the boulder, Timothy, the mountain man, was trying to provide covering fire. But he was outnumbered and outgunned. "We need to move," Timothy Cooper said urgently. "They'll have us pinned down in another minute." Karen looked around desperately, trying to find an escape route. The game trail continued down toward the creek, but that would take them directly into the line of fire. The slope above them was too steep to climb quickly and would leave them exposed to enemy fire. Then she saw it, a narrow ravine that led away from the creek, hidden by overhanging rocks and dense vegetation. It would be a difficult climb, but it might offer them a way out of the trap. "There," she said, pointing toward the ravine. "Can we make it?" Timothy Cooper studied the terrain and nodded grimly. "It's our best chance, but we'll have to move fast." They gathered their gear and prepared to make a run for the ravine. But as they were about to move, Jeremy Hall's rifle cracked from his position above, and one of the remaining gunmen cried out in pain. "Now," Timothy Cooper said, and they sprinted toward the ravine as fast as the rocky terrain would allow. Behind them, gunfire erupted again as the surviving criminals tried to stop their escape. Bullets sparked off rocks and whistled through the air around them, but somehow they managed to reach the cover of the ravine without being hit. The climb up the ravine was exhausting and dangerous. The walls were steep and unstable, with loose rocks that threatened to give way under their weight. But it offered concealment from the gunmen below, and that was all that mattered. As they climbed, Karen could hear Timothy, the mountain man, shouting from his position by the creek. "Karen? Karen? Is that you? I'm here," she called back, though she wasn't sure he could hear her over the sound of gunfire. "We're here to help." "Get out of here," Timothy shouted back. "It's too dangerous. These men are killers." But Karen had no intention of leaving him to face the criminals alone. She and her companions had come too far and risked too much to abandon him now. Somehow, they had to find a way to turn the tables on the remaining gunmen. At the top of the ravine, they found themselves on a rocky ledge that offered a view of the entire creek area. From this vantage point, they could see the positions of both Timothy and the two surviving criminals. "There," Timothy Cooper said, pointing toward a cluster of boulders where one of the gunmen was hidden. "If we can get a clear shot from here, we might be able to end this." Jeremy Hall had apparently had the same idea. His rifle cracked again from his position above, and the second gunman stumbled and fell, clutching his shoulder. That left only one criminal still in the fight, but he was the most dangerous of the three. Karen could see him moving with professional skill from cover to cover, trying to get a clear shot at Timothy while avoiding the crossfire from above. "He's good," Timothy Cooper observed grimly. "This isn't going to be easy." The remaining gunman had apparently reached the same conclusion. Instead of continuing the fight, he began to withdraw, moving carefully from boulder to boulder as he worked his way upstream. "He's running," Karen said with relief. But Timothy Cooper shook his head. "No, he's not running. He's repositioning, probably trying to get to higher ground where he can control the whole battlefield." As if to confirm his words, the gunman's voice echoed from somewhere upstream. "This isn't over, mountain man. We know where you live now, and we know who your friends are. You can't hide forever." In his out, the threat sent a chill through Karen. If the criminals knew about her involvement, they might come after her boarding house, putting the entire town at risk. "We need to end this now," she said, "before he gets away and brings back reinforcements." Timothy Cooper nodded grimly. "Agreed. But how? He's got the high ground now, and he knows we're here." The answer came from an unexpected source. Timothy, the mountain man, had apparently been listening to their conversation, and he had a plan of his own. "I'm coming up," he called out. "Cover me." Before anyone could stop him, Timothy broke from his cover behind the boulder and began climbing toward their position. The remaining gunmen immediately opened fire, but Timothy moved with the fluid grace of someone who had spent years navigating treacherous mountain terrain. Timothy Cooper and Jeremy Hall provided covering fire, forcing the gunman to keep his head down while Timothy made his climb. Within minutes, the mountain man had reached their position on the ledge. Karen's first close look at Timothy in 2 days showed the toll that his ordeal had taken. His clothes were torn and dirty, his face was gaunt with exhaustion and hunger, and there was a haunted look in his eyes that spoke of things seen and done that no man should have to endure. But he was alive, and that was all that mattered. "Thank God you're safe," Karen said, fighting the urge to embrace him. Timothy looked at her with a mixture of gratitude and concern. "You shouldn't have come. This is my fight, not yours." "It became our fight when that marshal tried to frame you for murder," Karen replied. "We know the truth now, Timothy. We know who really killed Sarah Mitchell." Timothy's expression darkened. "Where is he?" "The marshal? Wounded and under guard back in town," Timothy Cooper explained. "But he has associates, and they're the ones hunting you." "I know," Timothy said grimly. "I've been running from them for 2 days. They're professionals, and they're not going to give up until they get their gold back or I'm dead." "About that gold," Karen said. "Do you still have it?" Timothy reached into his pack and pulled out the leather pouch that had started all the trouble. "Every coin. I was going to try to return it to whoever it was stolen from, but I needed to clear my name first." The sight of the gold reminded Karen of just how much was at stake. This wasn't just about Timothy's life anymore, but about a criminal conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. "We need to get back to town," she said. "The marshal is ready to talk, and with your testimony and this gold as evidence, we might be able to bring down his entire organization." But Timothy shook his head. "It's not that simple. There's still one of them out there, and he's not going to let us just walk away." As if summoned by his words, the remaining gunman's voice echoed from somewhere above them. "I can wait all day, mountain man, and when night falls, I'll come for you in the dark." Karen realized that they were still trapped, still at the mercy of a professional killer who had all the advantages. The rescue mission had become a siege, and she wasn't sure they had the resources to survive it. But Timothy, the mountain man, had spent years learning to survive in these mountains, and he wasn't ready to give up yet. "I know these peaks better than he does," Timothy said quietly. "If we can hold out until dark, I might be able to turn the tables on him." "What do you have in mind?" Timothy Cooper asked. Timothy studied the terrain around them, his experienced eyes picking out details that the others missed. "There's a way down from here that he doesn't know about. An old mining tunnel that connects to a network of caves. If we can reach it without being seen, we can disappear completely." "And then what?" Karen asked. "Then we become the hunters instead of the hunted," Timothy replied with a grim smile. "It's time this killer learned what it feels like to be prey." The old mining tunnel that Timothy had mentioned was barely visible from their position on the ledge. Just a dark crack in the rock face about 100 yards to the east. To reach it, they would have to cross an open stretch of granite that offered no cover from the gunman above. "He'll see us the moment we start moving," Jeremy Hall observed, studying the route through his spyglass. Timothy, the mountain man, shook his head. "Not if we time it right. See that cloud bank moving in from the west? When it passes over the sun, we'll have maybe 10 minutes of dim light. That's our window." "My dad." Karen looked up at the approaching clouds, dark and heavy with the promise of snow. The storm that had been threatening all day was finally moving in, and with it came the possibility of escape. "What about after we reach the tunnel?" she asked. "Where does it lead?" "The old Copper Ridge mine," Timothy replied. "It's been abandoned for 20 years, but the tunnels are still solid. There's a whole network of passages that connect to caves throughout this part of the mountain range." Timothy Cooper frowned. "Sounds like a good way to get lost underground." "Better than getting shot above ground," Timothy replied. "And I know those tunnels. Spent a lot of time exploring them when I first came to the mountains." The cloud bank was moving closer, its shadow creeping across the valley below. Karen could feel the temperature dropping as the storm approached, and she pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders. There's something else you should know, Timothy said quietly. The Marshal's associates aren't the only ones looking for me. Word's gotten out about the gold, and there are bounty hunters and claim jumpers heading this way from 3 territories. How many? Karen asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Hard to say, but I've seen sign of at least a dozen different groups in the past 2 days. Some are working together, some are competing with each other. It's turning into a small war out here. The implications were staggering. What had started as a simple case of murder and theft had escalated into something that threatened to tear apart the entire region. And Timothy was at the center of it all, carrying stolen gold that everyone wanted and testimony that could bring down a criminal conspiracy. All the more reason to get you back to town safely, Karen said. The territorial authorities need to know what's happening out here. Assuming we can trust the territorial authorities, Timothy Cooper added grimly. If the Marshal was telling the truth about corruption in the government, we might not know who to trust. The shadow of the cloud bank was almost upon them now, and the light was beginning to dim. Timothy, the mountain man, gathered his gear and prepared to move. Stay low and move fast, he instructed. Don't stop for anything until we reach the tunnel. If someone gets hit, the others keep going. We can't afford to get pinned down in the open. Karen checked her revolver one more time, making sure it was loaded and ready. She had never been in a gunfight before, and she hoped she wouldn't freeze up when the shooting started. Ready? Timothy asked. They nodded, and he led them out onto the open granite face. The rock was slippery with moisture from the approaching storm, and Karen had to concentrate on every step to avoid falling. Behind them, she could hear the gunman moving, probably trying to get a better angle for his shots. They were halfway to the tunnel when the shooting started. The first bullet sparked off the rock just inches from Karen's feet, followed by a rapid series of shots that sent stone chips flying in all directions. Move, 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 Timothy shouted, breaking into a run despite the treacherous footing. Karen ran as she had never run before, her heart hammering against her ribs as bullets whined around her. She could hear Jeremy Hall's rifle answering from somewhere behind her, trying to provide covering fire. The tunnel entrance was closer now, just a few more yards. But the gunman had found his range, and his shots were getting closer with each round. Timothy Cooper cried out and stumbled, clutching his left arm. Blood was seeping between his fingers, but he kept moving, driven by desperation and adrenaline. Almost there, Timothy, the mountain man, called out, reaching the tunnel entrance first. Karen dove through the opening just as another bullet shattered the rock where she had been standing. Timothy Cooper followed, still bleeding but mobile, and Jeremy Hall brought up the rear, firing one last shot at their pursuer before disappearing into the darkness. The tunnel was pitch black and filled with the musty smell of old timber and stagnant air. Timothy fumbled in his pack for a lantern while the others caught their breath and assessed their injuries. How bad is it? Karen asked Timothy Cooper, examining his wounded arm by the dim light of the lantern. Bullet went clean through, he said through gritted teeth. Hurts like hell, but I'll live. Karen tore a strip of cloth from her shirt and bound the wound as best she could. It wasn't a professional job, but it would have to do until they could get back to Dr. Young. Can you still shoot? Timothy, the mountain man, asked. Timothy Cooper flexed his fingers and winced. With my right hand, yes, but I won't be very accurate. We need to keep moving, Jeremy Hall said, peering back toward the tunnel entrance. He knows where we went, and he might try to follow us. Timothy led them deeper into the tunnel, the lantern casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. The passage was narrow and low, forcing them to move in single file and duck their heads to avoid the wooden support beams. Where does this lead? Karen asked, fighting off a growing sense of claustrophobia. Several places, Timothy replied. There are side passages that connect to other mines, and natural caves that go deeper into the mountain. The trick is knowing which way to go. And a day, at Comtalazen, they walked for what felt like hours through the winding passages, sometimes climbing, sometimes descending, always surrounded by the oppressive weight of solid rock. Karen had lost all sense of direction and had to trust Timothy's knowledge of the underground maze. Finally, they emerged into a large, natural cavern lit by shafts of dim light filtering down from cracks in the ceiling. The space was vast and cathedral-like, with formations of limestone that had been carved by centuries of flowing water. We can rest here for a while, Timothy said, setting down the lantern. This cavern has 3 different exits, so if anyone follows us, we have options. Karen sank gratefully onto a flat rock and pulled out her water bottle. The underground journey had been exhausting, and she was beginning to feel the effects of the thin mountain air and the stress of constant danger. "How do you know about all these tunnels and caves?" she asked Timothy. "When I first came to the mountains, I spent a lot of time underground," he replied. "It was quiet down here, peaceful. No reminders of what I'd lost. No people asking questions or offering sympathy I didn't want." Karen could understand the appeal of the underground solitude. After losing his wife and daughter, Timothy had needed a place to grieve without interference, and the caves had provided that sanctuary. "But you came back to the surface," she observed. "You started living above ground again." Timothy nodded slowly. "Eventually, I realized that hiding underground wasn't living. It was just another kind of death. So I built a cabin, started trapping and hunting, tried to make some kind of life for myself. And now? Now, I'm not sure what comes next. Even if we get out of this mess alive, I can't go back to my old life. Too many people know about me now, know where to find me." Karen felt a pang of guilt. By vouching for Timothy and bringing him into town, she had destroyed the anonymity that had been his protection. He would never again be able to disappear into the wilderness and live in peace. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "This is all my fault. If I hadn't interfered, you could have just disappeared back into the mountains." Timothy looked at her with surprise. "Karen, you saved my life. If you hadn't spoken up when you did, I'd be hanging from that oak tree in Cedar Falls right now. But now you can't go home. You can't go back to the life you built for yourself." "Maybe that's not such a bad thing," Timothy said thoughtfully. "I've been hiding from the world for 8 years, telling myself I was better off alone. But these past few days, working with you, feeling like part of something bigger than myself, maybe it's time I rejoin the human race." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of voices echoing from one of the tunnel entrances. Male voices, speaking in low, urgent tones that suggested they were trying not to be overheard. Timothy quickly extinguished the lantern, plunging the cavern into near darkness. They crouched behind a formation of limestone columns, listening as the voices grew closer. "Trail goes cold here," someone was saying. "Check the side passages," came another voice. "They can't have gone far." Karen recognized the voice of the gunman who had been pursuing them. Somehow, he had managed to follow them through the tunnel system, and now they were trapped again. Timothy pulled out his knife, the blade gleaming faintly in the dim light from above. Timothy Cooper and Jeremy Hall readied their rifles, though Karen wondered how effective firearms would be in the confines of the cavern. The voices were getting closer now, and Karen could see the flicker of torchlight from one of the tunnel entrances. There were at least 3 men, possibly more, and they were conducting a systematic search of the cave system. "This way," Timothy whispered, leading them toward one of the other exits. "There's a passage that leads to the surface about half a mile from here." They moved as quietly as possible across the cavern floor, trying to avoid loose rocks that might betray their presence. But the space was vast and filled with obstacles, and in the darkness it was almost impossible to move silently. A stone shifted under Jeremy Hall's foot, the sound echoing through the cavern like a gunshot. Immediately, the voices stopped, and Karen could hear the searchers changing direction. "There," someone hissed, "by the far wall." Gunfire erupted in the confined space, the sound deafening as it bounced off the stone walls. Muzzle flashes lit up the cavern in brief, stroboscopic bursts, revealing running figures and the deadly dance of hunter and hunted. Timothy pushed Karen toward the tunnel entrance, while Timothy Cooper and Jeremy Hall returned fire, trying to cover their escape. The passage was narrow and twisted, barely wide enough for one person at a time. "Go, go, go," Timothy urged, pushing her ahead of him into the tunnel. Behind them, the gunfight continued, the sound growing more distant as they moved deeper into the passage. Karen could hear Timothy Cooper shouting something, but the words were lost in the echo of gunshots. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, winding through solid rock with no end in sight. Karen's lungs burned from the thin air and the exertion of running, but she forced herself to keep moving. Finally, she saw light ahead, real daylight filtering down from the surface. The tunnel ended in a vertical shaft with rough-hewn handholds carved into the rock. It was a treacherous climb, but it offered escape from the underground maze. "Can you make it?" Timothy asked, looking up at the shaft. Karen nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure. The climb looked difficult and dangerous, and she had no experience with rock climbing. But the alternative was to go back and face the gunmen in the tunnels. She started climbing, her fingers finding purchase on the crude handholds. The rock was wet and slippery, and more than once she nearly lost her grip. But somehow she managed to keep climbing, driven by desperation and the knowledge that Timothy was counting on her. The shaft was deeper than it had looked from below, and by the time she reached the surface, her arms were shaking with exhaustion. She pulled herself out onto a rocky ledge and immediately turned to help Timothy up. They emerged into the gray light of late afternoon, with snow beginning to fall from the heavy clouds overhead. The storm that had been threatening all day had finally arrived, and with it came both opportunity and danger. "Where are we?" Karen asked, looking around at the unfamiliar landscape. "About 2 miles north of Willow Creek," Timothy replied. "We're higher up the mountain now, but we're also more exposed." The snow was falling more heavily now, driven by a bitter wind that cut through their clothes like knives. Karen pulled her coat tighter and tried to get her bearings. "What about Timothy Cooper and Jeremy Hall?" she asked. "Are they going to be able to find us?" Timothy's expression was grim. "I don't know. That gunfight in the cavern, it didn't sound good." The possibility that their companions might be dead or wounded filled Karen with guilt and horror. She had asked them to risk their lives to help her save Timothy, and now they might have paid the ultimate price for her decision. "We have to go back," she said. "We can't just leave them." "Karen, if we go back, we'll be walking into a trap. Those gunmen will be watching every exit from the cave system." "Then what do you suggest? That we just abandon them?" Timothy was quiet for a moment, studying the terrain around them. The snow was falling more heavily now, and visibility was decreasing rapidly. "There might be another way," he said finally. "If I can get back to my cabin, I have supplies and weapons cached there. With better equipment, we might be able to mount a rescue." "How far is your cabin?" "About 5 miles, but it's rough country, and this storm is getting worse. In these conditions, it could take us hours to get there." Karen looked at the swirling snow and felt a chill of fear. She had heard stories of people who had gotten lost in mountain blizzards, found days later frozen to death just yards from safety. But she also knew that staying where they were wasn't an option. "Lead the way," she said. Timothy nodded and struck out across the rocky terrain, following what looked like a barely visible game trail. Karen stayed close behind him, trying to step in his footprints to conserve energy and avoid losing the path. The storm intensified as they climbed higher, the wind howling through the peaks like a living thing. Snow stung Karen's face and made it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. Several times she lost sight of Timothy completely and had to call out to him to avoid getting separated. They had been walking for over an hour when Timothy suddenly stopped and held up a hand for silence. Through the howling wind, Karen could hear something that made her blood run cold. Voices. Human voices. Calling out through the storm. "They're still following us," Timothy said grimly. "Even in this weather, they're not giving up." Karen peered through the swirling snow, trying to see their pursuers. The voices seemed to be coming from multiple directions, suggesting that there were several groups searching for them. "How many?" she asked. "Hard to tell in this storm, but it sounds like more than just the Marshal's associates." Word must have spread about the gold. Word? The implications were terrifying. They were being hunted by multiple groups of armed men, all willing to kill for the stolen gold that Timothy carried. And they were trapped in a blizzard that was getting worse by the minute. "Your cabin," Karen said urgently. "How much farther?" Timothy studied the terrain around them, trying to get his bearings in the storm. "Maybe 2 miles. But we'll have to cross some exposed ridges to get there." "Can we make it before they catch us?" "I don't know, but it's our only chance." They pressed on through the storm, fighting against wind and snow that seemed determined to drive them back. The voices of their pursuers grew closer at times, then faded as the searchers were forced to take shelter or lost the trail in the blizzard. Karen's feet were numb with cold, and her hands were so stiff that she could barely grip her revolver. She began to understand how people died in mountain storms, not from any single catastrophic event, but from the gradual accumulation of cold and exhaustion that sapped their strength and will to survive. But Timothy kept moving, driven by knowledge of the terrain and years of experience surviving in harsh conditions. He led her along ridges and through valleys, always seeming to know exactly where he was going despite the limited visibility. Finally, just as Karen was beginning to think she couldn't take another step, Timothy pointed ahead to a dark shape barely visible through the snow. "There," he said, "my cabin." It wasn't much to look at, just a small log structure built into the side of a rocky outcrop. But to Karen, it looked like salvation. Shelter from the storm, warmth, and hopefully the supplies they would need to survive the night. Timothy led her to the door and fumbled with a key hidden under a loose stone. The cabin was dark and cold inside, but it was dry and protected from the wind. "I'll get a fire started," Timothy said, moving toward a stone fireplace. "There's food in the cache and weapons if we need them." Karen sank into a rough wooden chair and tried to warm her hands. The cabin was spartanly furnished but comfortable, with the kind of practical efficiency that came from years of bachelor living. As Timothy built up the fire, Karen looked around at his home. There were few personal touches, just the basic necessities for survival. But on a shelf near the fireplace, she noticed something that made her heart ache. A small wooden frame containing a daguerreotype of a woman and a young girl. Timothy's lost family, the wife and daughter whose deaths had driven him into the wilderness. "They were beautiful," she said softly. Timothy looked up from the fire and followed her gaze to the photograph. His expression softened with remembered love and pain. "Mary and Elizabeth," he said quietly. "They've been gone 8 years, but sometimes it feels like yesterday. Is that why you came to the mountains? To be closer to them, somehow?" Timothy was quiet for a moment, staring into the growing flames. "I came here to die," he said finally. "I thought maybe if I went far enough into the wilderness, if I took enough risks, nature would do what I couldn't bring myself to do." The admission shocked Karen with its raw honesty. She had suspected that Timothy's isolation was about more than just grief, but she hadn't realized the depth of his despair. "But you didn't die," she said. "No. Turns out I was better at surviving than I thought, and after a while the pain became manageable. Not gone, but not overwhelming either. And now?" Timothy looked at her across the flickering firelight. "Now I'm not sure what I want. For 8 years I've been living day to day, not thinking about the future. But these past few days, being around people again, feeling like I'm part of something important, it's made me realize that maybe there's still life left in me after all." The conversation was interrupted by a sound from outside. A soft scraping, like someone moving carefully through the snow. Timothy immediately reached for his rifle, motioning for Karen to stay quiet. The sound came again, closer this time. Someone was definitely outside the cabin, probably trying to determine if it was occupied. Timothy moved to the window and peered out through a gap in the shutters. What he saw made him curse under his breath. "What is it?" Karen whispered. "At least 6 men, maybe more. They've found us." Karen felt her heart sink. After everything they had been through, after all the risks and sacrifices, they were trapped again. And this time, there was nowhere left to run. The men outside the cabin moved with professional efficiency, surrounding the structure and cutting off all possible escape routes. Timothy watched them through the shutters, counting at least 8 figures moving through the snow. "They're not the same group from the caves," he whispered to Karen. "These are different men, better organized. Bounty hunters, maybe, or federal marshals. It's hard to tell in this storm." A voice called out from the darkness, authoritative and commanding. "Timothy Cooper, we know you're in there. This is Deputy Marshal Brian Rivera with the Territorial Marshal Service. Come out with your hands up, and no one needs to get hurt." Karen felt a flicker of hope. If these really were federal marshals, then perhaps their ordeal was finally over. But Timothy's expression remained skeptical. "How do we know you're really marshals?" he called back. "We've already encountered one fake federal officer today. Because we have proper credentials and a legal warrant for your arrest," came the reply. "You're wanted for theft of federal property and conspiracy to commit robbery." Timothy looked at Karen with grim resignation. "Even if they are real marshals, I'm still carrying stolen gold. That makes me a criminal in their eyes, regardless of how I came by it." "But you can explain what really happened," Karen said. "Tell them about the marshal we captured, about Sarah Mitchell's murder." You think they'll believe the word of a mountain hermit over official federal charges? Before Karen could answer, the voice outside spoke again. You have 1 minute to come out peacefully, Cooper. After that, we're coming in, and we won't be gentle about it. Timothy checked his rifle and moved to a position where he could cover the door. Karen, there's a root cellar under the cabin. If shooting starts, get down there and stay down. I'm not leaving you to face this alone. You've done enough already. More than enough. If something happens to me, someone needs to survive to tell the truth about what happened to Sarah Mitchell. The minute was almost up, and Karen could see men moving closer to the cabin through the storm. They carried themselves with the disciplined bearing of professional lawmen, but she had learned not to trust appearances. Time's up, Cooper, the voice called out. We're coming in. The door exploded inward as two men hit it simultaneously, their shoulders splintering the wooden frame. They rolled aside as they entered, making room for others to follow, their movements coordinated and practiced. Timothy's rifle cracked once, and one of the intruders spun and fell. But there were too many of them, and they kept coming, spreading out to cover the small cabin with overlapping fields of fire. Drop your weapon, the leader shouted, his pistol trained on Timothy's chest. Drop it now, or we'll kill you where you stand. Timothy hesitated for a moment, then slowly lowered his rifle. He was outnumbered 8-1, and Karen was in the line of fire. There was no choice but to surrender. Smart man, the leader said, stepping forward into the firelight. He was tall and lean, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent in the saddle. His badge looked genuine, and his authority seemed real. Are you really Deputy Marshal Rivera? Karen asked, studying his face. I am, and you must be Mrs. Bennett, the woman who's been harboring this fugitive. Karen felt a chill at the formal tone in his voice. Timothy isn't a fugitive. He's an innocent man caught up in circumstances beyond his control. That's for a judge to decide, ma'am. Right now, he's wanted on federal charges, and my job is to bring him in. One of the other marshals was searching Timothy, removing weapons and checking for concealed items. When he found the leather pouch containing the stolen gold, he whistled softly. Well, looks like the stories were true after all. Deputy Marshal Rivera examined the gold, weighing the pouch in his hand. That's a lot of money, Cooper. More than most men see in a lifetime. It's not mine, Timothy said quietly. I found it at what I thought was an abandoned camp. I was going to return it to whoever it was stolen from. Sure you were. That's what they all say. Karen stepped forward, her anger overriding her caution. He's telling the truth. We have the real thief in custody back in Cedar Falls. A man who claimed to be a federal marshal who murdered a 17-year-old girl to cover up his crimes. Deputy Marshal Rivera studied her with interest. That's quite a story, Mrs. Bennett. You have any proof to back it up? Dr. Young examined the girl's body and found fabric from the killer's coat clutched in her hand. The man confessed to being part of a robbery ring that's been hitting supply trains throughout the territory. And where is this alleged killer now? Wounded and under guard in Cedar Falls. We were planning to transport him to the territorial capital as soon as he was stable enough to travel. The deputy marshal exchanged glances with his men, and Karen could see them weighing her story against the evidence of the gold in Timothy's possession. Even if what you're saying is true, Rivera said finally, it doesn't change the fact that Cooper here was found with stolen federal property. That makes him a thief under territorial law. He found what he thought was abandoned property and took only what he needed to survive, Karen argued. That's not the same as robbing supply trains. The law doesn't make distinctions based on intent, ma'am. Possession of stolen goods is a crime, regardless of how you came by them. Timothy spoke up for the first time since surrendering his weapon. Marshal Rivera, there's something else you need to know. The man we captured claimed that there's corruption in the territorial government, that officials have been taking bribes to look the other way on these robberies. Rivera's expression darkened. That's a serious accusation, Cooper. You have any proof? Only his word, but he seemed pretty confident that he had protection in high places. Names. Did he give you any names? Timothy shook his head. He died before we could get specifics, but he made it clear that this robbery ring has connections throughout the territorial administration. The deputy marshal was quiet for a long moment, considering the implications. If there really was corruption in the territorial government, then he couldn't be sure who to trust with his prisoners or his evidence. Marshal Rivera, Karen said, sensing his uncertainty, Why don't you come back to Cedar Falls with us? See the evidence for yourself. Talk to Dr. Young. Examine the prisoner we're holding. Then you can make an informed decision about what to do next. Rivera studied her face, looking for signs of deception. You're asking me to trust the word of a suspected thief and the woman who's been harboring him. I'm asking you to look at the evidence before you decide who's guilty and who's innocent. One of Rivera's men stepped forward. Sir, we have our orders. We're supposed to bring Cooper in for trial. I know what our orders are, Rivera replied curtly. But if there's really corruption in the territorial government, we need to be very careful about who we turn our prisoners over to. The storm outside was intensifying, the wind howling around the cabin with increasing fury. Snow was beginning to drift through the broken door, and the temperature inside was dropping rapidly. We're not going anywhere in this weather, Rivera observed. Looks like we're stuck here until the storm passes. Timothy moved to close the door as best he could, using a piece of rope to hold the damaged frame together. There's food in the cache, he offered, and firewood out back. We might as well make ourselves comfortable. Rivera nodded to his men, who began to relax their guards slightly, while still keeping their weapons ready. The situation had shifted from immediate confrontation to an uneasy truce, with both sides waiting to see what would happen next. Karen helped Timothy prepare food while the marshals settled in around the cabin. The space was crowded with so many people, but the fire provided warmth, and the smell of cooking food helped to ease the tension. Tell me about this prisoner you're holding, Rivera said as they ate. What makes you so sure he's the real killer? Karen recounted the events of the past few days, from Timothy's arrival in town, covered in blood, to the marshal's confession in her boarding house. Rivera listened without interruption, occasionally asking for clarification or additional details. You said he had a partner? Rivera asked when she finished. According to his confession, yes. Someone he claimed to have killed after the murder of Sarah Mitchell. Did he say where the body was buried? North of Willow Creek, somewhere in the woods. He said the animals would have scattered the bones by now. Rivera made notes in a small notebook, his expression thoughtful. If we could find that body, it would go a long way toward corroborating his story. There's something else, Timothy said. When I found the gold at their camp, there were supplies scattered around like they'd left in a hurry. But there were also personal items, things that looked like they'd been taken from robbery victims. What kind of things? Jewelry? Watches? A woman's locket with a photograph inside. Items that wouldn't have much resale value but might be important to the people they were stolen from. Rivera's interest was clearly piqued. Where are these items now? Still at the camp, as far as I know. I only took the gold because I needed supplies, and I left some of my own gear in trade. Could you find this camp again? Timothy nodded. It's about 10 miles north of here, near the old logging road. But with this storm, it might be days before we could get there. One of Rivera's men looked up from where he was cleaning his rifle. Sir, if there really is a robbery ring operating in this area, shouldn't we be coordinating with other law enforcement agencies? Rivera's expression darkened. That's exactly what we can't do. Not if there's corruption in the territorial government. We don't know who's involved or how high it goes. Karen realized that Rivera was facing the same dilemma that had confronted Eugene Phillips and the other townspeople of Cedar Falls. How do you seek justice through a system that might be compromised? How do you know who to trust when the very institutions designed to protect you might be working against you? What do you suggest? She asked. Rivera was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. I think we need to go back to Cedar Falls and examine your evidence. If this prisoner you're holding really is part of a robbery ring, and if he's willing to provide information about his associates, then we might be able to roll up the entire operation. And if the territorial government is compromised, then we go over their heads, federal authorities, maybe the army, someone with the power and the integrity to clean house. Timothy looked up from where he was tending the fire. What about the bounty hunters and claim jumpers? There are dozens of armed men in these mountains looking for that gold. Even if we can prove my innocence, they're not going to care about legal niceties. Rivera nodded grimly. That's another problem we'll have to deal with. But first things first. We need to get back to civilization and sort out the legal issues. The storm continued to rage outside, showing no signs of letting up. Karen curled up in a corner of the cabin, using her pack as a pillow, and tried to get some rest. But sleep was elusive, her mind racing with thoughts of everything that had happened and everything that still lay ahead. She found herself thinking about Timothy Cooper and Jeremy Hall, the two townsmen who had risked their lives to help her rescue Timothy. Were they still alive? Had they escaped from the gunfight in the caves, or had they paid the ultimate price for their loyalty? And what about Cedar Falls itself? If word of the stolen gold continued to spread, the town might find itself overrun with treasure hunters and outlaws. The quiet community that had been her home for 15 years could be torn apart by the very events she had set in motion. But then she looked at Timothy, sleeping fitfully by the fire, and she knew that she had made the right choice. Whatever the consequences, she couldn't have stood by and watched an innocent man hang for crimes he didn't commit. The storm finally began to subside near dawn, the howling wind dropping to a whisper and the snow tapering off to occasional flurries. Rivera was the first to wake, moving quietly to check the weather outside. "Looks like we might be able to travel today," he announced. The snow stopped and the wind's dying down. Karen sat up, her body stiff from sleeping on the hard floor. Through the broken door, she could see pale sunlight filtering through the clouds, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and pink. "How long to get back to Cedar Falls?" she asked. "In these conditions, probably 6 or 7 hours," Rivera replied. "But we'll need to be careful. All this snow will have covered the trails, and it's easy to get lost in unfamiliar country." Timothy was already up and moving, gathering supplies and preparing for the journey. Despite everything that had happened, despite being a prisoner facing federal charges, he seemed almost relieved to be heading back to civilization. "There's something I need to tell you," he said to Rivera as they prepared to leave. "My real name isn't Timothy Cooper. I've been using false names for so long that I sometimes forget who I really am." Rivera looked up with interest. "What is your real name?" Timothy was quiet for a moment, as if reaching back through years of self-imposed exile to find his true identity. "Eugene Phillips," he said finally. "My name is Eugene Phillips." But Eugene Phillips was the name of Cedar Falls town leader, and Karen realized that Timothy was still confused about his identity. The years of isolation and the trauma of recent events had clearly taken a toll on his mental state. Rivera seemed to recognize the problem as well. "We'll sort out the identity issues later," he said diplomatically. "Right now, the important thing is getting everyone back to town safely." They set out across the snow-covered landscape, moving in single file with Rivera's men spread out to provide security. The going was slow and treacherous, with deep drifts hiding obstacles and making it difficult to follow the trail. But Timothy proved to be an excellent guide, his knowledge of the terrain helping them navigate around the worst obstacles. Despite his confusion about his own name, his understanding of the mountains remained sharp and reliable. They had been traveling for about 3 hours when one of Rivera's scouts called out a warning. "Riders, approaching from the south. Looks like a large group." Rivera immediately called a halt and deployed his men in defensive positions. Through his spyglass, he studied the approaching riders with growing concern. "At least 20 men," he reported, "armed and moving fast. Could be bounty hunters, could be something worse." Karen felt her heart sink. After everything they had been through, after coming so close to safety, they were about to be caught in another confrontation. "Can we avoid them?" Timothy asked. Rivera shook his head. "They're between us and Cedar Falls, and they're moving to intercept us. Looks like they know exactly where we are." The implications were chilling. If the riders knew their location and route, it suggested that someone had been tracking them, possibly since they left the cabin. They were walking into what might be a carefully planned ambush. "What do we do?" Karen asked. Rivera studied the terrain around them, looking for defensive positions or escape routes. But they were in relatively open country, with little cover and nowhere to run. "We make a stand," he said grimly, "and hope that federal badges still mean something to whoever's coming." But as the riders drew closer, Karen could see that these weren't ordinary bounty hunters or treasure seekers. They were too well organized, too professional in their movements. And at their head rode a figure that made her blood run cold with recognition. It was the gunman from Willow Creek, the one who had escaped from the fight in the caves, and he had brought reinforcements. The riders spread out as they approached, forming a loose semicircle that would make escape impossible. Rivera counted 23 men, all well-armed and moving with the coordination of experienced fighters. "Federal marshals!" Rivera called out as they drew within speaking distance. "You men are interfering with official business." The leader of the group, the gunman from Willow Creek, rode forward with a cold smile on his weathered face. "Marshal Rivera, I presume. I'm Captain Justin Young, Territorial Militia. I'm afraid you're the one interfering with official business." Rivera studied the man's uniform and credentials, his expression skeptical. "I wasn't aware the Territorial Militia had jurisdiction over federal crimes." "Special circumstances, Marshal. We're operating under emergency authority granted by the Territorial Governor. There's been a breakdown in law and order in this region, and we've been tasked with restoring stability." Karen felt a chill of recognition. The name Justin Young belonged to Cedar Falls doctor, but this man was clearly someone else entirely. Like the false marshal they had captured, he was using a stolen identity to provide legitimacy for his actions. "What kind of emergency authority?" Rivera demanded. Captain Young reached into his coat and produced an official-looking document. "Martial law has been declared in this district due to widespread criminal activity. All civilian law enforcement is now under military command." Rivera examined the document, his frown deepening. The papers looked authentic, with proper seals and signatures, but something about the situation didn't feel right. "I'll need to verify this with my superiors," Rivera said carefully. "I'm afraid that won't be possible, Marshal. Communication lines have been disrupted by the criminal activity in the region, but I can assure you that my authority is legitimate and absolute." Timothy stepped forward, his voice tight with anger. "This man is lying, Marshal Rivera. He's the one who's been hunting me, the one who was working with the false marshal we captured." Captain Young's expression didn't change, but Karen noticed his hand move closer to his sidearm. "I'm afraid your prisoner is delusional, Marshal. The trauma of his crimes has clearly affected his mental state." "I said not raid him." "What crimes?" Rivera asked. "Murder, theft, conspiracy to commit robbery. He's wanted in connection with a series of supply train robberies that have plagued this territory for months." Rivera looked back and forth between Timothy and the supposed militia captain, clearly trying to decide who to believe. The situation was complicated by the fact that Timothy was indeed carrying stolen gold, which gave credence to the accusations against him. "If you're really Territorial Militia," Rivera said slowly, "then you'll have no objection to accompanying us back to Cedar Falls so we can sort this out properly." Captain Young's smile turned predatory. "I'm afraid that won't be possible either, Marshal. My orders are to apprehend the fugitive and recover the stolen federal property. I'm not authorized to negotiate or delay, and I'm a federal officer with jurisdiction over federal crimes." Rivera replied firmly. "I'm not turning my prisoner over to anyone without proper verification of their authority." The standoff stretched taut as both sides weighed their options. Captain Young's men were positioned to attack, but Rivera's marshals were experienced fighters who wouldn't go down easily. The question was whether either side was willing to start a gunfight that would likely leave many dead. Karen realized that she might be the key to resolving the situation. If she could expose Captain Young as the imposter he was, it might tip the balance in Rivera's favor. "Captain Young," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "if you're really with the Territorial Militia, then you'll know about the prisoner we're holding in Cedar Falls. The one who confessed to murdering Sarah Mitchell." Young's eyes narrowed slightly, the only sign that her words had hit home. "I know of no such prisoner, ma'am." "Perhaps you're confused." "I don't think so. This prisoner claimed to be a federal marshal, just like you're claiming to be a militia captain. He also claimed to have associates throughout the territorial government." Rivera was watching the exchange with growing interest, clearly picking up on the implications of Karen's questions. "What are you suggesting, Mrs. Bennett?" he asked. "I'm suggesting that Captain Young here is no more a militia officer than his associate was a federal marshal. I think they're both part of the same criminal organization that's been robbing supply trains and corrupting territorial officials." Young's hand was now resting openly on his gun butt. "Those are serious accusations, ma'am. I hope you can back them up." "I can. You see, I know the real Dr. Justin Young. He's been the physician in Cedar Falls for over 20 years, and you're not him." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Rivera's men tensed, reading the situation and preparing for violence. Young's riders did the same, hands moving to weapons as they awaited their leader's command. "You're making a mistake, ma'am," Young said quietly. A very dangerous mistake. The only mistake I made was not recognizing you sooner, Karen replied. You're the gunman who escaped from the caves yesterday, the one who's been hunting Timothy for that stolen gold. Rivera drew his pistol in one smooth motion, training it on Young's chest. I think that's enough conversation, Captain, or whoever you really are. Young's response was swift and decisive. Instead of trying to draw his own weapon, he spurred his horse forward, using the animal's bulk as a shield while he shouted orders to his men. Take them alive if possible, but get that gold. Gunfire erupted across the snow-covered meadow as 23 outlaws opened fire on 8 federal marshals. Rivera's men were outnumbered nearly 3-1, but they had better positions and superior training. Karen dove for cover behind a fallen log, pulling Timothy down beside her. Bullets whined overhead, splintering wood and kicking up sprays of snow. The sound was deafening, a continuous roar of gunfire punctuated by the screams of wounded men and horses. Stay down, Timothy shouted over the noise, drawing the pistol that Rivera had returned to him before they left the cabin. This is going to get ugly. Rivera was directing his men's fire with professional calm, trying to make every shot count while conserving ammunition. But the odds were heavily against them, and Karen could see that several of his marshals were already wounded. Young had dismounted and was working his way closer to their position, using rocks and trees for cover. His movements were fluid and confident, those of a man who had survived many such encounters. He's trying to flank us, Timothy observed, tracking Young's progress with his pistol. Can you stop him? Maybe, but I'll have to expose myself to get a clear shot. Before Karen could object, Timothy was moving, rolling out from behind the log and coming up in a shooting position. His first shot took one of Young's men in the shoulder, spinning the outlaw around and sending him crashing into the snow. But the movement had revealed Timothy's position, and return fire immediately converged on his location. He rolled back behind cover just as bullets chewed up the ground where he had been lying. Timothy, Karen called out, fearing he had been hit. I'm all right, he replied, but she could see blood on his sleeve where a bullet had grazed his arm. The gunfight continued for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Rivera's men were holding their own, but they were running low on ammunition and taking casualties. Karen could see that the situation was becoming desperate. Then she heard something that made her heart leap with hope. The sound of approaching horses, coming fast from the direction of Cedar Falls. A lot of horses, suggesting a large group of riders. Young heard it too, and his confident expression faltered for the first time. He called out orders to his men, trying to reorganize their attack before the new arrivals could join the fight. But it was too late. A dozen riders crested the ridge to the south, their rifles already firing as they charged into the battle. At their head rode Eugene Phillips, the real Eugene Phillips, leading a rescue party from Cedar Falls. The tide of battle turned instantly. Caught between Rivera's marshals and the Cedar Falls volunteers, Young's outlaws found themselves outnumbered and outgunned. Some tried to surrender, others attempted to flee, but most were cut down in the crossfire. Young himself fought to the bitter end, emptying his pistol at the approaching townsman before finally falling to Eugene Phillips' rifle. He died in the snow, his stolen uniform stained with blood, his dreams of easy wealth buried with him in the mountain wilderness. When the shooting finally stopped, the meadow was littered with bodies and wounded men. Karen emerged from cover on shaking legs, hardly able to believe that they had survived the encounter. Eugene Phillips rode up to her, his weathered face creased with concern. Mrs. Bennett, are you hurt? I'm all right, she replied, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. How did you find us? Timothy Cooper and Jeremy Hall made it back to town this morning, Eugene explained. They told us what happened in the caves, said you'd gone after the mountain man. We've been tracking you since dawn. Karen felt a surge of relief at the news that their companions had survived. Are they badly hurt? Jeremy took a bullet in the leg, but he'll be fine. Timothy Cooper is already back on his feet and demanding to join the search party. Rivera approached, holstering his pistol and surveying the aftermath of the battle. Mr. Phillips, I'm Deputy Marshal Rivera. I want to thank you for your timely intervention. Just doing our civic duty, Marshal. Though I have to admit, we weren't sure whose side you were on when we first spotted you. Understandable, given the circumstances. It seems this region has been infiltrated by criminals posing as law enforcement officers. Eugene Phillips nodded grimly. That's what we're afraid of. The prisoner we're holding back in town claims that the corruption goes all the way to the territorial capital. We'll need to investigate those claims thoroughly, Rivera said. But first, we need to get everyone back to town and tend to the wounded. As they prepared for the journey back to Cedar Falls, Karen found herself walking beside Timothy, despite everything they had been through, despite the danger they had faced and the lives that had been lost. She felt a sense of completion that had been missing from her life for years. "What happens now?" she asked him. Timothy was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "I don't know. The charges against me will probably be dropped once Marshal Rivera hears the full story and examines the evidence. But I can't go back to living alone in the mountains. Too many people know about me now." "Would that be such a bad thing? Living around people again?" Timothy looked at her with something that might have been hope in his dark eyes. "Maybe not. I've been thinking about what you said back in the cabin, about rejoining the human race. Maybe it's time I stopped running from life. And maybe it's time I stopped hiding from it," Karen replied. "I've been so focused on maintaining my independence, on proving that I could survive on my own, that I forgot what it means to truly live." They walked in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts about the future. The ordeal they had shared had changed them both, stripping away the protective barriers they had built around their hearts and revealing the fundamental loneliness that had driven them to the edges of society. "Karen," Timothy said eventually, "when this is all over, when the legal issues are resolved and the criminals are brought to justice, would you consider? That is, would you be interested in?" He trailed off, unable to find the words for what he was trying to say. But Karen understood, and she felt her heart skip a beat at the possibilities his unfinished question suggested. "Yes," she said simply. "Whatever you're asking, the answer is yes." Timothy's face lit up with the first genuine smile she had seen from him since they met. It transformed his weathered features, revealing the man he had been before grief and isolation had carved such deep lines around his eyes. "I don't even know what I'm asking yet," he admitted. "I just know that I don't want to lose what we've found together." "You won't," Karen assured him. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." Behind them, the rescue party was organizing the wounded and preparing for the long journey back to civilization. Ahead lay Cedar Falls and the complex legal proceedings that would be needed to unravel the criminal conspiracy they had uncovered. But for the moment, Karen was content to walk beside Timothy through the snow-covered wilderness, two survivors who had found something precious in the midst of tragedy and violence. They had started as strangers thrown together by circumstance, but they were ending as partners bound by shared danger and mutual respect. The mountain man had walked into town, covered in blood, and the widow who fed him had indeed changed everything. But the change had gone both ways, transforming them both from isolated individuals into something stronger and more complete than either could have been alone. As they crested the ridge that would give them their first view of Cedar Falls, Karen realized that she was finally going home, not just to the boarding house that had sheltered her for 15 years, but to a life that held the promise of genuine companionship and shared purpose. The ordeal was almost over, but the real adventure was just beginning. The journey back to Cedar Falls took most of the day, slowed by wounded men and the need to transport prisoners. Several of Young's outlaws had survived the gunfight, and Rivera was determined to bring them back alive to stand trial and provide testimony about the criminal conspiracy. As they descended from the high country, the landscape gradually became more familiar to Karen. She recognized landmarks and trails that she had known since childhood, markers of a world that seemed both unchanged and completely transformed by recent events. Dr. Young, the real Dr. Young, met them at the edge of town with a wagon loaded with medical supplies. His face was grim as he surveyed the wounded men, both lawmen and outlaws, who would need his attention. "How many casualties?" he asked Rivera. "3 of my men wounded. 2 seriously. 5 prisoners, 3 of whom need medical attention, and several of the townspeople took minor injuries in the fighting." Dr. Young nodded and began organizing the wounded for transport to his clinic. Karen watched him work with professional efficiency, and she couldn't help but compare him to the imposter who had stolen his name. The real doctor was older, gentler, with a kind of steady competence that came from decades of healing rather than years of violence. "Mrs. Bennett." Eugene Phillips approached her as they reached the outskirts of town. There's something you need to know about the prisoner we've been holding. Karen felt a chill of apprehension. What about him? He's been talking. A lot. Seems the prospect of hanging has made him very cooperative. What has he told you? Eugene's expression was troubled. Names, dates, amounts of money. He's given us details about the entire criminal organization, including which territorial officials have been taking bribes. That's good news, isn't it? It would be, if we knew who to trust with the information. According to him, the corruption goes all the way to the territorial governor's office, maybe higher. The implications were staggering. If the territorial government was compromised at the highest levels, then bringing the criminals to justice would require federal intervention on a massive scale. What does Marshal Rivera think we should do? He's planning to send a coded message to his superiors in Denver, requesting immediate assistance. But that will take time, and we don't know if Young's associates will try to rescue the prisoners or silence them permanently. As if summoned by their conversation, Rivera approached with a grim expression on his weathered face. Mrs. Bennett, Mr. Phillips, we have a problem. I just received word that a company of territorial militia is en route to Cedar Falls. They claim to be responding to reports of civil unrest. How long until they arrive? Eugene asked. Tomorrow morning, maybe sooner. And given what we now know about corruption in the territorial government, I'm not inclined to trust their motives. Karen felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders once again. By vouching for Timothy and setting these events in motion, she had brought danger not just to herself, but to her entire community. What can we do? She asked. We need to get the prisoners and the evidence out of town before the militia arrives, Rivera said. If they're working with the criminal organization, they'll try to free the prisoners or eliminate them to prevent further testimony. Where can we take them? Fort Collins is the nearest army post. If we can get there, we'll be under federal military protection while this gets sorted out. Eugene Phillips studied the map Rivera had spread out on a nearby tree stump. That's a 3-day ride in good weather. With prisoners and wounded men, it could take a week. Then we'd better get started, Rivera said grimly. As the townspeople prepared for what was essentially an evacuation, Karen found herself thinking about the boarding house she would be leaving behind. It had been her home and her livelihood for 15 years, the foundation of the independent life she had built after Thomas's death. But looking at it now, she realized that it had also been a kind of prison, a place where she had hidden from the world and its complications. The events of the past week had shown her that there was more to life than mere survival, more to existence than just getting by from day to day. Having second thoughts? Timothy asked, appearing beside her as she stood looking at her home. No, she said, surprised by the certainty in her own voice. I'm thinking about new beginnings. It won't be easy, starting over at our age. Karen smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years. Nothing worthwhile ever is. But at least we won't be starting over alone. Timothy took her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. No, he agreed. We won't be alone. The preparations continued through the evening, with the entire town mobilizing to help with the evacuation. Wagons were loaded with supplies, weapons were distributed, and plans were made for the dangerous journey ahead. Brenda Thompson, the town gossip who had once criticized Karen for harboring Timothy, approached with a basket of food and a shamefaced expression. Mrs. Bennett, she said awkwardly, I owe you an apology. I was wrong about your mountain man, wrong about your judgment. If you hadn't stood up for him, that poor girl's real killer might never have been caught. Karen accepted the apology graciously, understanding that fear and uncertainty made people do things they later regretted. We all did what we thought was right at the time, Brenda. That's all anyone can do. As night fell, the caravan began to take shape. Rivera's remaining marshals would provide security, while the townspeople would handle the logistics of moving prisoners, wounded men, and essential supplies. Timothy would ride with the group, no longer as a prisoner but as a witness whose testimony would be crucial to prosecuting the criminal conspiracy. The stolen gold he had found would serve as evidence, proof of the robberies that had funded the corruption throughout the territorial government. Are you ready for this? Karen asked him as they prepared to depart. As ready as I'll ever be, Timothy replied. For 8 years, I've been running away from life, hiding in the mountains and telling myself I was better off alone. Now I'm running towards something instead of away from it. What are you running toward? Timothy looked at her in the moonlight, his weathered face soft with emotion. A future, a real future, with someone I care about and work that matters. And if the territorial militia catches up with us, if we don't make it to Fort Collins, then at least we'll have tried. At least we'll have stood up for what's right, regardless of the consequences. The caravan moved out just before dawn, a long line of wagons and riders stretching across the valley floor. Karen rode beside Timothy near the front of the column, while Rivera's marshals provided security at the flanks and rear. Behind them, Cedar Falls lay quiet and empty, its residents either fled to relatives in other towns or hidden in the surrounding hills. It was a ghost town now, a casualty of the criminal conspiracy that had infected the entire region. But Karen felt no sadness at leaving it behind. The town had been her refuge for 15 years, but refuges were meant to be temporary. Now it was time to venture back into the world and help build something better. The first day of travel passed without incident, the caravan making good time across familiar country, but as they moved deeper into the wilderness, the sense of being hunted grew stronger. Rivera's scouts reported dust clouds on the horizon, suggesting that they were being followed by a large group of riders. The territorial militia, or what remained of Young's criminal organization, was closing in. "How far to Fort Collins?" Karen asked Rivera during a brief rest stop. 2 days, maybe less if we push hard, but the horses are already tired, and the wounded men can't take much more of this pace. What if we don't make it? Rivera's expression was grim. Then, we make our stand wherever we are and hope that federal justice means something in this God-forsaken territory. That evening, they made camp in a defensible position among a cluster of rocky hills. Rivera posted sentries and organized the able-bodied men into defensive positions, preparing for an attack that seemed increasingly inevitable. Karen found herself thinking about Sarah Mitchell, the 17-year-old girl whose murder had started this entire chain of events. She had died simply because she had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, a victim of the casual violence that seemed to follow criminals wherever they went. But her death had not been meaningless. It had exposed a conspiracy that might have continued for years, robbing and killing with impunity. And it had brought together two lonely people who had found something precious in their shared struggle for justice. "Do you think she would have approved?" Karen asked Timothy as they sat by the campfire. "Sarah Mitchell, I mean. Do you think she would have wanted us to risk so many lives to bring her killers to justice?" Timothy was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. "I think she would have wanted her death to mean something," he said finally. "I think she would have wanted to know that good people were willing to fight for what's right, even when it's dangerous. And if we don't survive this, if the militia catches up with us and we all die out here in the wilderness, then at least we'll die knowing that we tried, that we didn't just stand by and let evil triumph because it was easier than fighting." Karen nodded. Understanding the truth of his words, they had all made their choices, and now they would live or die by the consequences. But she had no regrets about the path that had led them to this moment. The attack came just before dawn, when the sentries were tired and the camp was at its most vulnerable. The territorial militia, if that's what they really were, struck from 3 directions simultaneously, trying to overwhelm the defenders through sheer numbers. But Rivera had chosen his position well, and the townspeople of Cedar Falls had learned to fight during their recent ordeals. The attack was repelled, but at a terrible cost in lives and ammunition. "We can't take another assault like that," Rivera admitted as they counted their casualties. "We're down to our last few rounds, and half the men are wounded." "How far to the fort?" Eugene Phillips asked. "Maybe 6 hours, if we abandon the wagons and ride hard." "What about the prisoners? The wounded?" Rivera's face was haggard with exhaustion and the weight of command. "We'll have to leave them, take the most important witnesses and evidence, and pray that we can get help back here in time." It was a terrible decision, but Karen could see that there was no alternative. They had pushed their luck as far as it would go, and now they had to choose between saving everyone and saving the mission. "I'll stay," she said suddenly. "Someone needs to tend the wounded, and I'm not essential to the legal case." "No," Timothy said immediately. "If you stay, I stay. We're partners, remember? Timothy, your testimony is crucial. You're the only one who can connect all the pieces of this conspiracy, and you're the only one who believed in me when everyone else wanted to see me hang. I'm not leaving you behind." Rivera looked back and forth between them, clearly torn. "We need both of you," he said finally. "Mrs. Bennett's testimony about the false marshal is just as important as Cooper's account of finding the gold. The debate was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. A lot of horses, moving fast and coming straight for their position. "Here they come again," Eugene Phillips said grimly, checking his rifle. But as the riders crested the ridge, Karen saw something that made her heart leap with joy. These weren't territorial militia or criminal associates, but blue-uniformed cavalry from Fort Collins. At their head rode a colonel with silver hair and the bearing of a professional soldier. He surveyed the scene with experienced eyes, taking in the defensive positions, the wounded men, and the obvious signs of recent battle. "I'm Colonel Brenda Thompson," he announced, dismounting and approaching Rivera. "We received your coded message about criminal activity in this region. Looks like we arrived just in time." Rivera stepped forward, relief evident in his voice. "Colonel, I'm Deputy Marshal Rivera. We have prisoners and evidence relating to a criminal conspiracy that reaches into the territorial government. So, I gathered from your message. My orders are to provide federal protection for your witnesses and transport them safely to Denver for questioning." As the cavalry troopers took charge of the situation, Karen felt the tension that had been building for days finally begin to ease. They had made it. Against all odds, through violence and betrayal and the constant threat of death, they had managed to bring the truth to light. Timothy found her among the organized chaos of the military camp, his face showing the same mixture of relief and disbelief that she felt. "It's really over," he said, as if he couldn't quite believe it himself. "This part is," Karen agreed. "But the trials will take months, maybe years, and there's still the question of what we do with the rest of our lives." Timothy took her hands in his eyes serious but hopeful. "I know what I want to do with mine," he said. "I want to spend it with you, if you'll have me." Karen felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of finally finding someone who understood her, who valued her for who she was, rather than what society expected her to be. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'll have you." They were married 3 months later in Denver, after the trials were concluded and the criminal conspiracy was finally broken. The ceremony was small and simple, attended by Marshal Rivera, Dr. Young, and a few other friends they had made during their ordeal. The corruption investigation had indeed reached into the highest levels of territorial government, resulting in dozens of arrests and a complete reorganization of law enforcement throughout Colorado Territory. The stolen gold was returned to its rightful owners, and the families of robbery victims finally received some measure of justice. Timothy's charges were dropped, of course, and he received a commendation from the territorial governor for his role in exposing the criminal conspiracy. But more importantly, he had found his way back to the human community he had abandoned 8 years earlier. Karen sold her boarding house in Cedar Falls and used the proceeds to buy a small ranch outside Denver, where she and Timothy could start their new life together. It wasn't the grand romance of storybooks, but something deeper and more lasting. A partnership built on mutual respect, shared values, and the knowledge that they could depend on each other when times got tough. "Do you ever regret it?" Timothy asked her one evening as they sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. "Giving up your independence? Your carefully ordered life?" Karen considered the question seriously. "I gave up isolation," she said finally. "But I gained something much more valuable. I gained a life worth living." Timothy nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. They had both spent years hiding from the world, protecting themselves from further pain by avoiding meaningful connections with other people. But in doing so, they had also cut themselves off from the possibility of joy, growth, and genuine fulfillment. The mountain man had indeed walked into town covered in blood, and the widow who fed him had changed everything. But the change had been mutual, transforming two broken people into something whole and strong and capable of facing whatever challenges the future might bring. As the stars appeared in the darkening sky above the Colorado mountains, Karen reflected on the strange series of events that had brought them together. A murdered girl, a case of mistaken identity, a criminal conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government, all of it leading to this moment of quiet contentment on a ranch they now called home. It hadn't been the life either of them had planned, but it was the life they had chosen together. And that, Karen thought, as she reached for Timothy's hand in the darkness, made all the difference in the world. 5 years had passed since the trials that had shaken Colorado Territory to its foundations, and the small ranch outside Denver had become everything Karen and Timothy had hoped it would be. The house they had built together was modest but comfortable, with a wide porch that offered views of the mountains where Timothy had once lived in solitude. The ranch itself was thriving, with cattle grazing in the lower pastures and a vegetable garden that provided more food than they could eat. Timothy had discovered a talent for animal husbandry that surprised them both, while Karen had found that her organizational skills translated well to managing the business side of their operation. But it was the human connections they had rebuilt that gave their life its deepest meaning. Marshall Rivera had become a regular visitor, bringing news from the wider world and updates on the ongoing efforts to clean up corruption throughout the territorial government. Dr. Young had retired to a small house in Denver, where he served as an unofficial consultant on medical matters and a beloved grandfather figure to the neighborhood children. Even Eugene Phillips had found his way to their ranch, having sold his interests in Cedar Falls and moved west to start fresh. The town itself had never fully recovered from the events of 5 years ago, gradually emptying as people sought opportunities elsewhere. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't stepped off that porch," Karen said to Timothy as they worked together in the garden one morning. "If I had just stayed inside and let the town have its way with you." Timothy straightened up from the tomato plants he was tending, his weathered face creasing with a smile. "You'd still be running that boarding house, taking in strangers and wondering if there was more to life than just getting by from day to day. And you? I'd be dead, hanged for a crime I didn't commit, or killed by those outlaws in the mountains. Either way, the world would have been a little darker, a little less just." Karen nodded, understanding the truth of his words. Their intervention had not just saved lives, but had exposed a corruption that might have continued for decades. The supply train robberies had stopped, the criminal conspiracy had been broken, and dozens of innocent people had been spared the fate that had befallen Sarah Mitchell. "Do you think about her?" Karen asked. "Sarah Mitchell?" "Every day," Timothy replied without hesitation. "She's the reason we met, the reason any of this happened. In a strange way, her death gave us life." It was a sobering thought, but not a morbid one. They had built something meaningful from tragedy, had found love and purpose in the midst of violence and corruption. Sarah Mitchell's death had not been meaningless because it had led to justice and to the joining of two souls who might otherwise have lived and died alone. A rider was approaching from the direction of Denver, moving at the unhurried pace of someone bearing routine news rather than urgent business. Karen shaded her eyes against the morning sun and recognized the familiar figure of Marshall Rivera, now promoted to district chief and responsible for law enforcement throughout much of Colorado Territory. "Brian," Timothy called out. Using the name Rivera had finally revealed to be his real one after years of working under various aliases. "What brings you out our way?" Rivera dismounted and accepted the cup of coffee that Karen offered, settling into one of the porch chairs with the satisfied sigh of a man who had ridden far and was grateful for rest. "Official business, I'm afraid," he said, though his tone suggested it wasn't anything too serious. "There's been a development in the Mitchell case." Karen felt a flutter of anxiety. The trials had been concluded years ago, the criminals convicted and sentenced. She had thought that chapter of their lives was finally closed. "What kind of development?" Timothy asked. "The kind that brings closure," Rivera replied. "We found the body of the marshal's partner, the one he claimed to have killed after Sarah Mitchell's murder." Karen remembered the confession, the casual way the false marshal had described killing his own associate for being sloppy about the girl's death. "Where?" "Exactly where he said it would be. In the woods north of Willow Creek. Animals had scattered the bones, just like he predicted, but we found enough to confirm the identity and cause of death." "Why does that matter now?" Timothy asked. The case was already solved. Rivera took a sip of his coffee before answering. "Because it corroborates the last major piece of his testimony. Everything he told us about the criminal organization, about the corruption in the territorial government, about the supply train robberies. It's all been proven true. This was the final confirmation that his confession was genuine and complete." Karen understood the significance. With every detail of the false marshal's testimony now verified, the authorities could be certain that they had identified and prosecuted all the major players in the criminal conspiracy. There would be no more surprises, No more discoveries of corruption that had been overlooked. So it's really over, she said. It's really over, Rivera confirmed. The last of the appeals have been exhausted, the final sentences carried out. Colorado Territory is finally free of the criminal organization that plagued it for so many years. The news should have brought satisfaction, but Karen found herself feeling strangely melancholy. The case that had defined the last 5 years of their lives was truly closed, which meant that the shared purpose that had brought them all together was no longer needed. What happens now? She asked. To all of us, I mean. Rivera smiled, understanding her concern. Life goes on, Karen. We've built friendships that go beyond the case that brought us together. We've created something good out of something terrible. He was right, of course. The bonds they had forged in crisis had been strengthened by years of peaceful cooperation. They were no longer united by shared danger, but by shared values and genuine affection for each other. There is one more thing, Rivera said, reaching into his saddlebags. Something that belongs to you. He pulled out a small wooden box, worn smooth by years of handling. Inside, wrapped in faded silk, was a silver locket that Karen recognized immediately. Sarah Mitchell's locket, she breathed, the one Timothy found at the outlaws' camp. Her family wanted you to have it, Rivera explained. They said that without your courage in standing up for Timothy, their daughter's killer would never have been brought to justice. Karen opened the locket with trembling fingers, revealing the miniature portrait of a young girl with bright eyes and an infectious smile. Sarah Mitchell, as she had been in life. Full of hope and promise, before violence had cut short her dreams. And of crucive eyes in, she was so young, Karen whispered. 17, Timothy said quietly. Just 17 years old. They sat in silence for a moment, remembering the girl whose death had changed all their lives. She had been a stranger to them, someone they had never met, but her fate had become intertwined with theirs in ways that none of them could have predicted. Her parents wanted me to tell you something else, Rivera said. They said that knowing their daughter's death led to something good, that it brought together two people who found love and built a life together. It helps them bear the grief. Karen felt tears prick her eyes. The idea that their happiness could somehow ease the pain of parents who had lost their child was both humbling and deeply moving. We should visit them, she said to Timothy. Pay our respects, let them know that we haven't forgotten her. Timothy nodded, understanding the importance of the gesture. We will. And we'll tell them about the ranch, about the life we've built. Maybe it will help them to know that something beautiful grew from their tragedy. Rivera finished his coffee and prepared to leave. His official business concluded, but his friendship with them as strong as ever. I'll be back this way in a few weeks, he said. Maybe I'll bring Elena with me this time. Elena was Rivera's wife, a school teacher from Denver, whom he had married 2 years earlier. Karen had met her several times and found her to be a woman of intelligence and warmth, someone who complemented Rivera's serious nature perfectly. Please do, Karen said. It's been too long since we had a proper dinner party. After Rivera had ridden away, Karen and Timothy returned to their work in the garden, but their conversation kept returning to the past and the strange series of events that had brought them together. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had never found that gold? Karen asked. If you had just walked past that abandoned camp without stopping? Timothy considered the question while he worked. The criminal organization would probably still be operating. Sarah Mitchell's killer would never have been caught, and you and I would never have met. But you'd still be alive. You'd still have your cabin in the mountains, your peaceful life away from all the complications of civilization. Would I? Timothy asked thoughtfully. I was dying up there, Karen. Just as surely as if I had a bullet in my chest. Dying of loneliness and despair, and the gradual erosion of everything that makes life worth living. Karen understood what he meant. She had been dying too, in her own way, slowly suffocating in the narrow confines of respectability and independence that she had built around herself like a fortress. I suppose we saved each other, she said. I suppose we did. That evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in familiar shades of gold and crimson, Karen found herself thinking about the cycles of life and death, loss and renewal that seemed to govern human existence. Sarah Mitchell had died, but her death had led to justice and to the love that Karen and Timothy had found together. The criminal organization had been destroyed, but from its ashes had risen a cleaner, more honest territorial government. The old life that each of them had known was gone, but in its place they had built something better. "Timothy," she said quietly, "there's something I need to tell you." He looked at her with concern, hearing something serious in her tone. "What is it?" Karen took his hand, feeling the calluses that years of honest work had left on his fingers. "I'm pregnant." The words hung in the evening air like a benediction, transforming the moment into something sacred and profound. Timothy stared at her for a long moment, his weathered face cycling through surprise, joy, and a kind of wonder that she had never seen before. "Are you sure?" he asked finally. "Dr. Young confirmed it yesterday when I went into town. I wanted to wait until we were alone to tell you." Timothy pulled her into his arms, holding her with a gentleness that spoke of precious things handled with infinite care. "A baby," he whispered. "After all these years, after everything we've been through, we're going to have a baby." Karen felt tears of joy streaming down her cheeks. At 43, she had thought her childbearing years were behind her. But life, it seemed, still had surprises in store. "What should we name her?" she asked, already certain somehow that the baby would be a girl. Timothy was quiet for a moment, thinking. "Sarah," he said finally. "If you agree, I'd like to name her Sarah." Karen nodded, understanding the rightness of the choice. Their daughter would carry the name of the girl whose death had brought them together, a living memorial to the idea that good could triumph over evil, that love could grow from tragedy, that hope could survive even the darkest of times. "Sarah it is," she agreed. As the stars appeared in the darkening sky above their ranch, Karen reflected on the strange and wonderful journey that had brought them to this moment. The mountain man who had walked into Cedar Falls covered in blood was gone, transformed into a loving husband and soon-to-be father. The widow who had fed him was gone too, replaced by a woman who had learned that true independence came not from isolation, but from the courage to love and be loved in return. Their daughter would grow up knowing the story of how her parents met, of the courage and sacrifice that had brought them together. She would understand that sometimes the most important battles are fought not for personal gain, but for justice and truth and the protection of the innocent. And perhaps when she was old enough to understand, Karen would take her to visit Sarah Mitchell's grave and tell her about the girl whose death had given them all life. She would explain that every ending contains the seeds of a new beginning, that every tragedy carries within it the possibility of redemption, and that love, when it finally comes, is always worth waiting for. The mountain man had walked into town covered in blood, and the widow who fed him had changed everything. But the change had been mutual, transforming two broken people into something whole and strong and capable of creating new life from the ashes of the old. As Karen and Timothy sat together on their porch, planning for the future and remembering the past, they knew that their story was far from over. There would be new challenges to face, new joys to discover, new sorrows to endure. But they would face them together, partners in the truest sense of the word, bound not just by love but by the shared understanding that they had been given a second chance at happiness and were determined to make the most of it. The stars wheeled overhead in their eternal patterns, and somewhere in the darkness, the spirit of a 17-year-old girl named Sarah Mitchell smiled down on the ranch, where love had triumphed over hate, where justice had prevailed over corruption, and where two lonely souls had found their way home to each other at last.